headphones.
Let's talk about camp life. Is everything okay?
I don't trust anyone.
She's playing us big time.
Too cocky, man.
That's so annoying.
When the time comes, alliances will have to be broken.
It's time to vote.
Survivor. Press red to watch now on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, welcome along to Wednesday morning on BBC Two. I'm here with you live. Now, Joe Coburn presents extensive coverage of the politics of the autumn statement.
Welcome to Westminster, where in just over an hour the Chancellor will deliver his autumn statement. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, economics editor, Faisal Islam, and business editor, Simon Jack.
Is now the right time for tax cuts, Chancellor?
In the last half hour, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, left Downing Street for the Commons. He's expected to announce tax cuts for workers and businesses, something he said was virtually impossible just a few months ago, and comes amidst the highest overall tax level in 70 years. We'll bring you the Chancellor's statement in full, plus Labour's response, the best analysis and political reaction here in the studio.
And I'm in Hull, where I'll be speaking to business owners, community leaders and many others who will no doubt have plenty to say about the Chancellor's announcements a little later.
Yes, it's Autumn Statement Day, the last big financial event of the political calendar and a big moment for the government. Consistently 20 points or so behind the Labour Party. They'll be hoping to turn around their fortunes. Now, before the Chancellor stands up and delivers his statement, we will bring you Prime Minister's questions. Then Jeremy Hunt will get to his feet and unveil his package of measures and announcements. Now, there has been a steady stream of kite flying, pre-announcements and speculation to keep us busy on programmes like Politics Live for days. We are now certain that there will be some tax cuts, personal, individual ones, and for business too. This, of course, a year out possibly from a general election. Who would have thought we would have had announcements of tax cuts? And there may be another surprise. We'll have to wait and see. But will people feel better off anytime soon? And will there be any political dividend or credit for Rishi Sunak and his government? Now, a year ago, if you can remember that far back, Jeremy Hunt talked about eye-wateringly difficult decisions as he unravelled Liz Truss's doomed economic plan. In September, he said tax cuts were virtually impossible. But today, we're told to expect them. Are the difficult decisions over, Chris?
No, but what they're trying to do is suggest that we're heading into a kind of new economic and, they hope, political phase. So they've spent all year, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, talking about inflation. They argue that they've turned a corner on that because they've met their target of it halving within the calendar year, although it's still well above the overall
Bank
target
of England
getting to 2%. And as you might just have noticed, there's an election on the horizon. So they want to sound a little more economically upbeat. But the change of tone and language in the last couple of days has been really quite something.
Yes.
Because until a matter of weeks ago, whenever there was a question around tax cuts, inevitable when you look at the size of the tax burden at the moment, they would say, oh, the only tax cut, as they would describe it, that really matters is dealing with inflation, blah, blah, blah. And they would just sort of kick the can down the road.
But they've sort of parked that a bit.
A little bit, but then more than that, you had that speech the other day, quite unorthodox for a Prime Minister to give an economic speech 2 days out from a fiscal event, as Westminster likes to call days like this, in which he was falling over himself to say tax cuts, cutting taxes, every other sentence. It wasn't one of those political speeches where you had to kind of look at the subtext.
No. It was clear, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was abundantly clear. And the interesting thing, one of the first things actually to measure, I think, this afternoon against, particularly on the whole question of tax cuts, is does what we hear from the Chancellor match the rhetoric that we heard from the Prime Minister? Both what is announced today, but then also what might be hinted at or indicated could be coming in a budget in the spring?
Well, let's put the sort of announcement of tax cuts coming, as you say, politically extremely interesting, bearing in mind what had come before. If we just have a look at this graph, Faisal, and our viewers can look at it too. Tax as a percentage of GDP from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, well, that's also very clear. I mean, just look at the figure. Trajectory for 27-28, 37.7%. As Chris was saying, it would be the highest on record. Tax cuts coming, will they change that figure? Will they make a difference to the tax burden overall?
They may temper that trend, but the sorts of scale that we're hearing about, even if that was the only thing that happened, wouldn't change it hugely. But there is a question as to the detail of what we get. We're expecting the National Insurance Bill, yes, to be reduced. But is that all we're going to get on tax today? For example, could they extend the freeze to thresholds, which hugely outweighs these sorts of moves, as you'll hear from Paul Johnson, I think, from the IFS in a moment. I mean, they've calculated that freeze and thresholds that Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor, is still First Lord of the Treasury, we should not forget, at number 10, so he still has the ultimate responsibility. When he decided to freeze those thresholds, it was worth about £7 billion a year. Then they extended it, they expanded it, and that hit the brick wall of very, very high inflation. And the net result is that could be worth by 2028 50 billion a year. And I remember when I first heard that figure, I said, so over how many years is that 50 billion? Yeah. They're like, 1 year. Yeah. And so that is 6-7
well,
pence.
To check, it is just 1 year.
It is 1 year, and that's in 2028. So the sorts of quantum we're talking about, is it a tax cut? Is it a partial refund on a significant tax rise?
And the curiosity, I think, in the whole political conversation here, which is that there's almost a bias in political reporting in the direction of what is seen to be an action, as opposed to not doing something. So if at a moment like this you get a tax that is put up proactively or taken down proactively, there follow the headlines. When a decision, because a decision not to act is still a decision, is taken to leave, say, a threshold where it is, there isn't that bong at the start of the news and thresholds have stayed where they are. But the cumulative effect of that over time, particularly at a time of high inflation, is, as Faisal says, extraordinary.
Yes. I mean, in terms of what else we might be expecting, we've also been leaked, briefed, clearly told that there will be an awful lot for business, because also the discussion has turned to growth.
That's right. This is going to be a business-heavy budget today. The centrepiece of it will be what they call full expensing. This is where companies, which they currently can at the moment, anything they spend on new machinery, new equipment, they can offset that against their profits, essentially get a 25% tax cut. That's due to be phased out in March 2026. What we'll hear today is they're going to make that permanent. That is there to get, and investment will be the theme of the entire budget, getting businesses to invest in themselves, getting individual savers to invest more in the UK, and getting pension funds. Expect to hear about the Edinburgh reforms to get pension funds to invest more in the UK. So investment's going to be a key bit of it. Businesses will like this. It comes at a cost. It's probably the single most expensive measure we'll see today, about £9 or £10 billion a year. But also they're going to make that permanent. The Labour Party have said they'll back it. So businesses have been calling this for a long time. So I think that will go down pretty well.
If it goes down pretty well, will it amount to any massive change in growth forecasts?
Well, there is some evidence that the previous regime, something called the super deduction, where you got extra money for every pound you invested, and the current scheme has seen business investment go up a bit. But there are people who have been mindful that it was going to be phased out. So there is some thought that people have brought it forward, that investment they might have done in future years, and they brought it forward to this. Will that, does that distort it? And what you'll get is an evening out over time. The secret sauce for the Chancellor is productivity. That's how efficient companies are. And that has been chronically poor. And that's because business investment in the UK has been at the bottom of the league of all other G7 countries, similar advanced economies. That's what they're trying to stimulate. And if you get productivity, it means you can grow faster without pushing up inflation. That's the holy grail, and that's what they'll be trying to aim at today.
Right, well, let's return to some of the key data, because as you were saying, Chris, inflation of course, was the main target of the government of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. And when he stands up at the dispatch box in just over an hour's time, he'll also have forecasts from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibilities. He sets out the measures and the state of the country's finances and the economy. Inflation was certainly their goal, that pledge of halving it. As you said, let's just have a look. You can see it's broadly under control. But as you reminded our viewers, it's still 2.5 times more than the Bank of England target of 2%. And there's been a little bit of discussion about whether governments actually bring down inflation or whether it's actually the Bank of England with its various interest rate rises. But it did lead to, again, the tone changing with the Prime Minister and Chancellor saying the economy is at a turning point. But let's just remind people that although the rate of inflation has come down, look at the change in prices from 21 to now, or pretty well now, last month of this year, because prices are still rising. They're rising more slowly, and the increases in that period of time are pretty well baked in. 25% for clothing, 30% for food, and a whopping 82% for energy. And the question is, with those figures, even if the government has met its target to halve inflation by the end of this year, do people feel better off?
And the answer for most people will be no, they won't. Even if there is a sense now that for many people earnings might be increasing marginally greater than prices now. But I think the diminishing returns politically of an argument that you hear from politicians about quote unquote sort of dealing with inflation is that, to make the obvious point, but it's worth making, this is not about prices falling. It just means they're rising at a slower level than they were, and those increases are kind of baked in, and people feeling that sense, that core sense, beyond all of the numbers and arguments that we'll hear today, of people feeling less well off than they did in the past. And I think that's the argument we'll hear, almost come what may today, whatever we hear from the Chancellor, is part of the critique from Labour.
We're just about to talk to Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Before we do, we were told by the government time and again over the past year they wouldn't do anything inflationary, won't do anything that might lead to inflation ticking up again. Well, what about tax cuts? Is there a risk, or is it
specifically told, as you said, that it was virtually impossible by the Chancellor? Yeah. This is quite interesting. Something has specifically changed over the past month from what we hear from the Chancellor on tax cuts, and they will argue that it's this inflation going down. But from what I understand, there may have been a change in the forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility, because although, as we will see, many of the forecasts for growth will be as sort of anemic as we have come to expect. So you don't get it from there. They do perhaps say that the tax kind of how plentiful the UK economy is in tax, that has increased, and they're changing their assumptions about that, and that is what is driving what they argue is room for manoeuvre, but is it real?
Right, Rishi Sunak just leaving number 10, heading for the House of Commons, because in just over half an hour's time we will have Prime Minister's questions. It's the sort of warm-up, if you like, on a day like this when the Chancellor is delivering his autumn statement. Let's talk to Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Hello to you, Paul. I'm going to put the graph back up, the tax as a percentage of GDP, with the trajectory by 27-28 of a record high of 37.7%. How likely is it that the overall tax level will come down anytime soon?
I think that's quite hard to achieve. Whatever the forecasts we've got going forward, we know that spending is higher than it's been. We know that debt interest payments are at certainly modern record levels, and I expect their OBR will be forecasting them to go up even further. So even if the Chancellor manages to squeeze some tax cuts in the short run, my guess is that the tax burden towards the end of the period will be not very dissimilar to what you're showing on that chart. However you tweak taxes now, we are in a position where debt is so high, debt interest payments are so high, spending is so high, we've got demographic change really beginning to hit. My guess is that that chart is not going to turn decisively down, well, possibly not in my lifetime, but certainly not over the next 5 years.
Well, obviously, we hope you live a very long time, Paul. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, how come then we're hearing about tax cuts today? Where's the Chancellor getting the money from?
Well, my guess is, as you heard Faisal say, the money is coming from both higher inflation, higher wage increases, higher corporation tax receipts. So there is more tax coming in. So if there's more tax coming in for a given rate of tax, you can cut the rate and still keep the tax coming in. So, so for example, relative to what the OBR and what the Treasury was expecting just back in March, simply keeping to current policy will raise an awful lot more, actually, from freezing those income tax thresholds and allowances. So to some extent, if we get a headline tax cut, it's really just offsetting some of those unintended increases that we're getting relative to the forecasts back in March.
Right, he could have chosen, of course, or I mean, we don't know, of course, for definite, but he could choose to reduce borrowing a bit more.
Yes, that's always an option open to chancellors. Do they, if things look better, do they bank the money or do they spend it? Now, what we've actually seen really all the way since 2010, and this is one of the reasons actually that the fiscal position is as it is that broadly speaking, when chancellors have been presented with slightly better economic news, they tend to spend most of the additional money that becomes available. But when they're presented with slightly worse economic news, they tend to push out the hard decisions and borrow more. And that, of course, is one of the things that over the last decade and more has ratcheted up the level of our debt.
Right. We're talking about the freezing of tax thresholds, which has brought in so much money. How many people are we talking about being dragged into paying higher rates of tax, Paul?
We're talking about several million. We're talking about something like an 80% increase over this period from, say, 2020 through to 2028. So something like 4 million additional higher rate taxpayers. That's a quadrupling relative to where we were 20 or 30 years ago. And that really is important. It's a change in the structure of the tax system. We used to think of the tax system as a basic rate paid by the large majority of people and a higher rate paid only by the really quite well off. We've now got a basic rate still paid by people on average earnings, but a higher rate paid by quite a lot of people on not very much above average earnings. And of course, then once you go above £100,000, you've got these higher rates, 60% and 45%. Those higher rates are now paid by pretty much as many people as were paying that 40% rate 20 or 30 years ago. So we've now got a real three-band, or actually four-band structure.
Thanks very much, Paul, and we'll come back to you, of course, once we've heard from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. Well, what about how today's announcements from the Chancellor might affect you? Well, the BBC's political editor for Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, Tim Iredale, there he is in Hull, at Marfleet Community Hull there. Would you tell us who you're going to be talking to?
Yes, hello, Joe. I'll introduce them as I go along. Welcome to Hull. We are in Marfleet in the east of the city. This is a city that's got a lot of positive stories to tell right now. There's a lot of investment, many new businesses, new jobs being created. But traditionally, this has been a very low-paid city where a lot of people are on long-term benefits. So with that in mind, many will be watching today's autumn statement very closely. Let me introduce, first of all, Becky Hart, who's the Regional Director of the CBI for Yorkshire and Humber. What would be a good autumn statement for you?
I think for CBI members, it will be all about measures that can really help boost investment and boost growth in the economy. We know that 62% of consumers are spending less on non-essential items, so we need to see some of that growth coming from the business community.
And what do you think to what you've heard so far? Because we know an awful lot of what's going to be in the statement, don't we?
So obviously we've seen some encouraging signs already, but what we're really hoping to get is full capital expensing made permanent. We're hoping to see elements on really kick-starting businesses' ability to decarbonise, but also mobilise their workforces as well.
Scott, welcome. Just tell us a little bit about your business and what you want to hear from the Chancellor.
My name's Scott Tompkinson. I run Humber Driving Solutions. We supply temporary drivers and training to companies in and around Hull. What we're looking for out of the statement is tax breaks, corporation tax, VAT breaks, stuff like that. To run a business at the moment, the taxation is absolutely astronomical. And a lot of businesses are struggling because of the tax and the amount of tax we are paying as a companies.
The Chancellor has promised tax cuts for businesses. How hopeful are you that it will benefit you?
I think it's a decision that's too late. for a lot of businesses. I've dealt with a lot of businesses that have gone to the wall because of this. So what he's promising, personally, I think it's too late. It really is too late now.
Kate, you're based here in this community centre in Marfleet. Tell us what you do and what you want to hear from Mr Hunt today.
Yeah, so we're Tyne Bank, Hull and East Riding. So we're part of what we would call a solidarity economy, where we bring people together to share time, where everyone's hours worth the same. So that's about bringing people together to support each other. But ultimately, with all grassroots community organisations, they're really feeling the impact of the lack of investment in public services like the health system, the mental health system, within local councils and everything. So, and this has an ongoing impact on people's ability to work and yeah.
So if it came to a straight choice between cutting taxes and investing more in public services, which would you go for?
I don't think it's a simple answer. I don't think it's just that. Obviously, small local businesses need more support, but then also there's a knock-on benefit if you take a systems perspective on this, on a lack of public services and the impact that has on the health of the community.
And you're a hotelier and a restaurateur. Tell us a bit more about your business and what you want to hear from the Chancellor.
We're a small boutique hotel and restaurant, so we're basically a bit of a community hub for Sunday roast dinners and things like that. So we're bringing together quite a large part of the community. So for me, the living wage increase is quite positive. Hopefully they'll see that people will be able to afford to go out and enjoy each other's time again. So important at the moment after the past few years. But you know, from the Chancellor, although the capital investments taxes possibly being increased, that would be beneficial in our planning for future business. Being a new business, it's a little too late for us now.
So this tax break for buying equipment, IT equipment, plant, etc. How does that affect your business? How would you benefit from that?
Well, as a new business, we're still looking to develop in other areas and to continue to plan and build more aspects of our business. So at least now we have a bit more time to make that planning. Put that planning into place rather than sort of knee-jerk investment right now to try and get in before the previous deadlines that were there. So it does provide us with a little bit of extra time to responsibly invest in developing the projects.
What about the cut to national insurance? How will that affect you and the people who work for you?
Very positive. If cuts to national insurance will helps out a little bit with the increase in wage bills that we'll have. We're always struggling for employment. So I think that's across the board in hospitality. Quality employment and training of that quality employment obviously comes at a cost, and a lot of people are moving down south to achieve those higher wages. So yeah, cuts would help.
I want to just come back to Becky, if I can, because locally we are expecting quite a big announcement from the Chancellor today, and that's a devolution deal for the City of Hull and East Yorkshire with an elected mayor. Now, what impact will that make? Because this is the last piece of the kind of northern devolution jigsaw here in the north of England, isn't it?
I think the business community would really like to see a devolution deal with an elected mayor be announced for Hull and the East Riding of Yorkshire. It is the only area of Yorkshire that wouldn't have one, and I think it's a really great opportunity to put the region on the map, have our voice heard, and also encourage inward investment into the region.
You agree, Scott?
Absolutely. Well, you know, Hull's a wonderful place. It's got a massive amount of potential. There's a lot of skills here as well that are not being tapped into.
Thank you all for now. More reaction from Hull a little bit later, but you have what? Little under 50 minutes to wait until the Chancellor gets on his feet. Back to you, Jo.
Thanks very much, Tim, there at the Community Centre in Hull. Let's pick up on some of those points, Simon. Interesting that one of the guests Tim was talking to reiterating an ongoing problem about struggling to recruit staff and, of course, the national living wage. We knew this already, but it is going to increase by more than £1 to £11.44 per hour from April next year. What's been the response?
Well, in some sectors, it's been pretty angry response, actually, because if in leisure and retail, for example, which has a high preponderance of people at or near the living wage, not only have they put it up by 10%, which of course to those people receiving it will be very welcome, but they've also reduced the eligibility of it from 23 to 21, and that has brought a whole lot more people into that into that bracket. And so retail bosses said to me, some businesses are looking at a 15 to 20% rise in their wage bill. They also say we're going to have no choice but to pass that through to our consumers in higher meal prices, drinks prices, etc. And how can you tell me that's not inflationary? And so there you have one thing which people do find is inflationary. On the other side, I expect the government to argue that we're going to increase the supply of labour. They're going to try and tackle this 2.6 million people who are on long-term sickness. That's a 20% increase in the last year or two, and they're going to say they're going to shrink the size of the carrot of benefits and sharpen the stick of the eligibility for those benefits, and I think that could prove quite controversial.
Yes, Chris, and we've been discussing this on Politics Live. They've been quite clear about the direction here. Yes, definitely a lot more stick and far less carrot, because they feel, the government, they're failing to get people back into work who are on sickness benefits, and also the implication that some people just don't want to work or are refusing to take up job opportunities.
Yeah, and I think we'll get a bit of that from the Chancellor shortly. In fact, I've just been sent what's known as the readout from the Cabinet meeting that happened
which has gone on
this morning, around about 8:30 this morning, which gives us some sense of the sort of broad tram tracks of the language we're likely to hear, I think, from Jeremy Hunt, and in particular on this whole issue of trying to get people back to work.
Yes.
An observation in Cabinet this morning from Mr Hunt, I'm told, of 100,000 people being signed on to benefits with no requirements to look for work because of sickness or disability, a waste of their potential, and for moral and economic reasons there needs to be what's described with capital letters, or at least capital letters at the beginning of each word, their back to work plan, which we'll hear from Mr Hunt shortly around how they do this. The government has been wrestling for the last couple of years, since the pandemic actually, not just around those who are perhaps not working because of sickness or disability, but also those who've just chosen to absent themselves from the labour market, about how as a government you go about trying to incentivise people to return. And all sorts of conversations have happened in government with some sense that it's tricky, it's going to be it hasn't necessarily worked.
Particularly, one of the arguments put forward, particularly by Labour politicians, is that when you look at the size of the NHS waiting lists, if people are waiting for treatment for months on end, how can you do anything about that large number of people who are still on benefits and can't work?
And I think we'll hear that as part of their critique as well. Just one broader point from that Cabinet readout whilst I'm talking about where our conversation started 15 or 20 minutes ago. Explicit language in that conversation at Cabinet this morning about the UK's economic policy changing gear. So just a sense of the language.
I mean, how important is all that tone and sentiment? Because in the end, if there is no political dividend for Rishi Sunak's government, I mean, we can say they've had an awful lot of resets, haven't they, since September, because we've had, the conference reset, we've had the reshuffle reset, we've now got the autumn statement, and those polls have remained stubbornly difficult. Is this the final sort of roll of the dice before election year rolls on next year?
I think there'll be more rolls of the dice.
I mean, they've got the budget, of course.
Yeah, the dice will keep rolling, I think, all the way until election day, really. But yeah, when you speak to Conservative MPs privately, there is exasperation that this has been an autumn where you've seen the Prime Minister pull various levers, rhetorical, political, economic, and from their perspective they feel that nothing has changed. So you had a conference speech which tried to define the Prime Minister against the previous 30 years, and then you fast forward a few months and you see a personification of a part of that time, the now Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, sitting around the Cabinet table. And then you had that speech the other day with the emphasis on tax cuts. But what was also quite interesting about that was that there was more of an attempt from Rishi Sunak to own the legacy of the last 13 years. But at the same time, there was a very sharp and personal reference to Liz Truss, who was obviously part of that, albeit as Prime Minister, a very small part of that.
Right, well, let's just go inside the House of Commons chamber. It is starting to fill up, as expected, on a Wednesday. We've got just over 15 minutes until Prime Minister's questions, and then, of course, that all-important statement at 12:30. Jeremy Hunt probably speaking for about an hour, and then the Shadow Chancellor for the Labour Party, Rachel Reeves, will stand up and give her response. We'll also hear from the SNP and Liberal Democrats. But let's go to Central Lobby, just outside the House of Commons chamber, and talk to two backbench MPs. There's Miriam Cates, Tory MP from the New Conservatives group on the right of the Conservative Party broadly, and Rebecca Long-Bailey, Labour MP, and who was Shadow Business Secretary under Jeremy Corbyn. Welcome to both of you. Miriam Cates, first of all, what do you want to hear from the Chancellor?
Good morning. Well, I think I'd like to see some tax cuts, of course.
Well,
we all
I
would.
think you're going to get those by the sounds of it.
But I think they need to be very much targeted around helping with the cost of living for ordinary people, and particularly tackling some of the cliff edges that we have in our tax system that really provide a brake on productivity. So specifically, one of the policies that our New Conservatives group has been lobbying for is a big increase to the VAT threshold. So at the moment, lots of businesses, lots of sole traders, people in trade, almost have to stop working as they approach the £80,000 turnover mark, because it's just not worth registering for VAT, having to charge that extra 20%. We could radically increase that £80,000 threshold and see a great increase in productivity in those kind of businesses who could then expand, employ people, take on more work. And then again, around the higher income child benefit charge, we've lobbied for that to be scrapped, because for some families at particular income level, they're at the moment paying 70% tax as they try and earn more money. So there are tweaks like that aren't massively expensive, but could provide a huge boost of productivity, which is what our economy needs right now.
Right. I mean, is the Chancellor listening to you? As you say, you've done lots of work on this, Miriam. Is he listening to what you're saying?
Well, we'll see, won't we? I think there's been trailed the national insurance cut, which of course is welcome, but I think it's about how that is targeted. 1 pence off national insurance is of course welcome, but really it's the thresholds and the cliff edges that are going to make the most difference to people.
Right, Rebecca, would you welcome cuts to national insurance for employees and employers, or should Labour be a little bit more ambitious with its own policies and prospectus in terms of tax and spend?
Well, certainly I welcome the sentiment of what Miriam set out, but I think the government has to recognise that over 14 million people in this country are currently living in poverty. 4 million of those are children. And the winter looks very, very bleak for them. So this autumn statement has to have an urgent anti-poverty strategy within it. Now, there are a number of measures the Chancellor can take. We've heard forecasts that there's £20 billion of headroom. So, for example, he could make a number of measures, such as reinstalling the £20 cut that was made to universal credit a while ago, taking away the two-child benefit cap limit to universal credit, and urgently increasing local housing allowance so that people who are in a housing crisis can actually afford to rent in their localities, because the fact is that we don't have enough council housing provision because the government hasn't been investing in council homes. Now, beyond that, of course, we need to see a plan to improve productivity. The economy is stagnating, and we need to see real investment in our public services, in our schools, and also in research and development and industrial strategy. And that's what I hope the Chancellor will set out today.
Right, Rebecca, if the Chancellor announces the tax cut, a tax cut to national insurance, will you support it?
Well, we'll have to see the details of that. But the problem is with previous tax cuts that the government have announced, they've often only benefited higher income earners, and very few of those on lower incomes have actually gained any real benefit from this. There's a crisis, and I don't think tax cuts alone are enough to address the poverty crisis that we're seeing, and that's why we need to see urgent investment in our welfare system.
Right. I mean, why should anyone vote Conservative now, Miriam? Even if there is a tax cut, it's a drop in the ocean when you look at the overall tax take and some of the issues and policies that you've outlined. 20% behind in the polls. Why should anyone vote Conservative?
Well, I think the biggest tax on people is inflation, and we've seen astonishing levels of inflation over the last year,
and they're still
2
high.
years. But we have halved that inflation. It's still too high, of course it is. But that is the #1 tax, if you like, that has been causing this cost of living crisis. It's putting prices up for everybody, especially people in poverty, the people that Rebecca rightly described. And I agree with a lot of what she said. I absolutely think we should scrap the two-child benefit limit, I think it's wrong. But I think we need to look at the structural issues behind some of the problems we've got in our economy. And really, the big issue we have is debt. Rebecca is right. It is being reported that the Chancellor has some headroom, but actually it's not headroom at all. It's just slightly less debt than was predicted. I think this year we will pay £83 billion just to service our debt. That's more than the school project. If the school's budget, if we are serious about tackling the cost of living, about tackling long-term poverty, we have to get the debt down. That's what's causing huge waste of public spending and high taxes.
Right. I mean, in terms of actually doing something transformational, Rebecca, why is Labour only saying, Rachel Reeves particularly, that she's broadly going to stick to Conservative spending plans? She hasn't categorically stated that, but she doesn't want to do anything radically different at this point.
Well, I understand at this stage we don't know when the general election's going to be, and we don't know how bad the economy is going to be when Labour comes to power. So she's right to be careful in setting out her stall on this. But ultimately, as a party, hopefully over the next few months, we'll have to start giving businesses some long-term certainty as to what an industrial strategy under a Labour government would look like. We do need to invest. I don't think it's the case that anybody would think that we can cut back on spending in those areas, because to have a productive economy, you've got to provide it with the tools it needs. It needs to have skills, and that means that we need to ramp up investment in higher education, further education, and within our schools. We need to have infrastructure. And that's why we need to see huge amounts of investment, particularly in transport and particularly in the north, who only get a small proportion per head compared to the south. That will encourage further business investment. And then beyond that, we've just got to compete with other leading industrial nations when it comes to investing in things such as research and development. We're lagging behind. We're not a world leader. We've got the greatest minds in the world, but they're not being supported by the government in their endeavours.
Right, well, thank you, both of you. Long list of demands there. I've taken some notes from both of you. Miriam Cates, Rebecca Long-Bailey, I'll let you take your seats in the House of Commons chamber for Prime Minister's questions, followed by that statement. Let's pick up on a couple of things that were said there. Miriam talking about interest debt payments and the soaring cost, of course, of those. But let's have a look at the borrowing forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility. Take us through those figures and why they are still so high.
They are very high, and what you're going to see, and what's incredibly interesting for me in terms of what comes out of the OBR this afternoon, is that, if you like, the fight between the fact that interest rates are higher, so that will, all things equal, push that up, and the fact that we're seeing this, what we call fiscal drag, where all of this tax revenue comes in, hitting up against the barriers of frozen thresholds. And it looks like the latter is winning. So those may be in a better position, where, as I said a month ago, they definitely thought that that was going to be worse because of the interest bill. But I want to pick up on something, because it's really important to clarify this. Both of your MPs there used the word headroom, right? Yeah. And as a shortcut, it's understandable that we say that that is spare cash, right? But that it can be quite misleading. What we have is a self-imposed constraint on borrowing, right? And they come in different forms, and the one that is biting right now is not the borrowing, that is the annual extra borrowing year to year. It's the level of debt, which is when you add all of it up, cumulatively, the percentage of national income. And it's just below 100%, and they need to get that coming down.
And they need to stick within, or they feel they certainly need to stick within.
This is, you know, it's an inexact science. It's all about kind of forecasting two big numbers and whether they kind of touch or reach, or whether they, you know, are they within 6 billion or each other. It is extraordinary that it becomes determinative of policy, right? I'll say that. And I think what it doesn't, sometimes it can be communicated that there are no choices. There are still choices. And one of the big choices here is inflation has brought in lots more tax revenue. Is that real revenue? Well, is it real? Or
is it illusory?
Is it a bit of an illusion? Because naturally, everything you spend on public spending has also gone up in price. Right. So to maintain the service levels of public services, and some might argue the public have noticed that the service levels in the NHS, in education, in the court system, and all that sort of stuff.
But spending has still gone up on some of those key services.
So there's two issues here. There's where has the money gone?
Yes.
But then also, you know, given that inflation is higher than we expected, if you want to maintain service levels, then would you choose to spend any spare cash on tax cuts now You know, is that no? That is the political
that's the
frame
political,
now from the Conservative Party. But actually, is it where the public is? I mean, I just throw that out there. We have choices.
Well, on that, there is a political choice, isn't there? Because as you say, yes, you can use it however you want to describe it, the headroom, the illusory money from borrowing a bit less. If you stick within those rules, you could use it for tax cuts. You could put it into more spending for public services, or you could pay down a bit more of, or reduce your borrowing in that sense. So what is the row?
Indeed. Or you could have, just to take one further step on from Faisal's analysis there, you could have an entirely different framework that didn't set the parameters in the way that the government currently chooses to do. Now, that is a broad parameter that is accepted by plenty of other political parties, broadly speaking. But that's not to say, in a different world, you couldn't have configured that more differently. And then just to make the more obvious point around inflation, just to sort of land that key point that you were just discussing, that yes, things, as our graph earlier was pointing out, are costing us more when we go to the supermarket and all the rest of it. It's also costing government more when it's trying to spend each pound of either borrowed or taxpayers' money on paying for a public service, and gets at least to part of the discussion that I think will be a big part of the conversation we're going to have in the general election campaign about whether public services are as good as they should be, and are people getting value for money? Is the government getting value for money for each pound it's spending on various elements of public services, particularly in that context of the amount that is currently being spent on servicing, paying the interest on the national
which
debt.
costs a fortune. I mean, it's interesting because there isn't much polling around just at the moment in terms of what would the public like, because the government has had this internal row within the Conservative Party about tax cuts. We need tax cuts, say parts of the party. Well, what about putting that money into public services? Would the public, if you put that question to them, would they say, I'd rather better public services, and I'd be happy for maybe the tax rate to stay the same, tax take, I should say, to stay the same. If you were to pay more tax, they might say no.
And this is the fascinating conversation around the political psychology of where the electorate is. So you can point factually to where the tax burden currently is, and you can point factually to the size of the state and make comparisons historically in the UK. Others will make comparisons, by the way, with countries around Europe.
Well, I was going to say, we don't, actually, the tax take isn't as high as a percentage of GDP as other countries
so
like
again,
France.
that's another choice you can make in terms of how you frame the conversation.
So I think the key thing in terms of how this lands with the public is, however, they want to put limits on this borrowing. They want to show the markets there are limits on this borrowing. And this is a mechanism through which this is communicated. This famous credibility. We saw how much it mattered 1 year ago when we were in this room and saw the charts going down before our eyes as I was
on
sat
your screen.
in this place. And the knock-on impact of that is mortgage rates, OK? And it seems like that is the sort of metric. And I think if
that means a lot to people, doesn't it? If you are a homeowner, is that metric?
And if the Chancellor in the back of his head is thinking of one thing, you know, just imagine, you are appointed Chancellor and the market's calm. You don't really have a big background in economics. That's going to stay with you. He'll be remembering that as he gives that speech, and he'll want to give an excuse at some point in the next 12 months for the Bank of England, not tell them, but an excuse for the Bank of England to cut interest rates.
I mean, that's an absolutely crucial discussion, if you like, between the Treasury and the Bank of England. Because if people take from this today, this tax cut, this rise in the living wage is anyway inflationary, then basically mood music means that interest rates and therefore borrowing costs and mortgage rates stay higher for longer. And that is politically toxic.
And the Labour Party will make an awful lot of that, won't they? Let's come back to this if we've got time. Just before Prime Minister's questions, we can go back into the chamber. I should think it's almost full as we're coming up to midday. Yes, you can see it there, everyone waiting for Prime Minister's questions and then the statement. But let's just take you through the expected measures that we've been talking about. The minimum wage to increase to £11.44 from April next year. The cut, as we've been talking about, national insurance. Yes, that's been announced, of course. Cut to national insurance by changing level or thresholds, we expect. Tax breaks for businesses, as Simon's been saying, with full capital expensing extended. That's deducting capital expenditure on things like machinery from profits. 110. We'll have to get you to go through all of those, Simon, measures to boost the economy and drive growth. I think we can go on to the next set. Tougher benefit rules we were talking about in the Back to Work plan. Now, benefits to increase by September 6.7% inflation figure. I'll come back to that in just a minute. And pensions could increase by earnings figure 8.5%. Just briefly, Faisal, before we go to Prime Minister's questions, there was some discussion that the government might decide to increase or uprate, I think is the term, benefits, working age benefits, by the lower inflation figure of 4.6% in October, which did seem to set all sorts of hairs racing. It looks as if they are sticking to the 6.7%, and pensions by 8.5%. That's the earnings figure because it's higher than growth or prices. But again, they were looking at stripping out bonuses, one-off bonuses and pay settlements. Again, not happening.
This may be the evolution from 3 or 4 weeks ago to where we are now. They were looking for, if you like, things that they could say were funding any giveaways. And it may be that the extra room for manoeuvre against their own targets has given them enough space to do the normal thing, which is to increase benefits with September's more generous figure, rather than looking for a saving of a couple of billion. And likewise, the pensions. Is it worth the hassle of giving the opposition, at least rhetorically, you haven't kept by the triple lock, when you can just go ahead with it? Is it worth the 400 or 500 million a year savings? These are the sorts of calculations that kind of mediated between number 10 and number 11.
And having let the hair run, you can then say,
no.
people thought,
yeah, speculation.
But we haven't done it.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely. And we did certainly talk about
hares
it.
or rabbits?
Yes,
well,
well, it
yes,
is the
hares
proverbial
running and
rabbit,
rabbits and
isn't it? But
hares.
you can set hairs run. Anyway, let's leave all our metaphors and analogies. In terms of certainty for business, do you think there will be more certainty for planning, which is what businesses want?
I expect a big part of this, it will probably won't make the headlines today, but it will cause big rows in the months and years to come. They're going to embrace or ratify something called the Windsor Report, which was basically how are we so bad at building energy infrastructure. It takes 15 years to get a new wind turbine connected to the national grid. Nick Windsor came out and says, I reckon I can do it in 7, and I expect them to do that. What that does mean, though, is that this energy infrastructure, getting it from the places where it's generated offshore, of the east coast of Scotland and Yorkshire, down to where it's used, predominantly in the southeast, you're going to have miles, hundreds of miles of cables, pylons, etc. So we may hear some consultation about how you sweeten that experience for the people who are going to be affected. Are they going to get money off their bills for hosting a pylon or a cable in their neighbourhood?
I think it's a bigger point here, which is, I think there is an impressive sounding, dozens and dozens of these measures, a little bit of microsurgery here and there that adds up to something potentially that will change the game on productivity.
Let's go into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, I know the thoughts of the whole House will be with the family and friends of the 4 teenagers who died in a car accident in North Wales. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we'll touch on it later, but let me just say we welcome the agreement reached overnight for a humanitarian pause in Gaza. This is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial step towards ending the nightmare for families of those taken hostage in Hamas's terror attack, and also addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Justin Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, his government will say that disabled people have a duty to work from home or lose their benefits, as if a suitable job of this kind is something that can be conjured up at will. It should be obvious to anyone that this kind of punitive policy isn't incentivising work, it's simply punishing disabled people who are already among the most marginalised in our communities. So can the Prime Minister do his duty and tell us now how many of the 137,000 jobs on the DWP Find a Job website are roles which specify that you can work from home?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't be right to preempt the Chancellor's autumn statement later, but let me just say this. I'm proud of this government's record in supporting those with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, not only have we closed the disability employment gap, not only have we increased the number of employers that are now disability confident, we're also making sure that we support those who are most vulnerable in our society, not least with the cost of living payments this year, which include £150 for all those on means-tested disability benefits.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that the measures taken to get us through the economic shocks caused by COVID and Putin's war were right for that time, but they are not the blueprint for the long-term successful economies of the future? It's innovation and skills and investment in these, such as the imminent rebuild of Harrogate College or the 12,000 local apprenticeships we've seen since 2010. These are our foundation, and not the fantasy fairy tale tens of billions of borrowing from the Labour Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right, and I'm proud that since 2010 we've created 5.5 million apprenticeships. And Mr. Speaker, that's the difference between us. We now know that the party opposite want to halve the number of apprenticeships if they were in office. Meanwhile, we want to make an apprentice education secretary. But my honourable friend is right. Labour's plans to borrow £28 billion a year would just push up inflation, interest rates and taxes, undermining all the progress that we've made on the economy. And it's only the Conservatives that will give people the opportunity to build wealthier, more secure lives for them and their families.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like the Prime Minister, I know the whole House will welcome the agreement reached overnight. We repeat our calls for Hamas to release all hostages immediately. This humanitarian pause must be used to get the hostages out safely, to tackle the urgent and unacceptable humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and to make progress to a full cessation of hostilities. Mr. Speaker, in recent years, the international community has treated the two-state solution as a slogan rather than a serious strategy, and that must now change. Like the Prime Minister, I'm sure I speak for everyone in the House in saying our hearts go out to the families and friends of the 4 young men from Shrewsbury who tragically lost their lives this week. It's a living nightmare for any parent, and I can hardly begin to imagine their loss. Mr. Speaker, this week the Prime Minister unveiled the latest version of his 5 pledges for the country. Let's hope he has more success with these than the last ones. Did he forget the NHS?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, not only when I became Prime Minister, just weeks after becoming Prime Minister, we injected record funding into the NHS and in social care. We also unveiled the first ever long-term workforce plan in the NHS's 75-year history. But I'm pleased he mentioned the 5 pledges because, as he knows, 3 of them are economic, and on a day which we will focus on the economy, I'm pleased to report that we have indeed halved inflation, no thanks to the party opposite. We have indeed grown the economy, and we have indeed reduced debt. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Well, the reason he ignored the NHS, not only in his new pledges, but just now, is because 7.8 million people are currently on the waiting lists. That's 500,000 more than when he pledged to bring them down nearly a year ago. And the Prime Minister just claimed that this is all about economic growth. So let me ask him, if a labourer or a care worker is forced to wait a year for an operation, how are they meant to help grow the economy?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing an enormous amount to bring waiting lists down. Enormous amount. Expanding patient choice, rolling out new community diagnostic centres, new surgical hubs, as well as putting more doctors and nurses in our ward. But I guess the question, Mr. Speaker, is when he talks about targets and waiting lists, I really just hope that the Welsh Labour government aren't listening. Because after 25 years in power, they're missing every single one of his targets. Weren't they meant to be his blueprint?
Mr. Speaker, more than double the entire population of Wales are currently on a waiting list in England. He really needs to take some responsibility. And on his watch, 2.5 million people are too sick to work, with the majority also suffering from mental health issues. On top of his failures on waiting lists, can he tell us how many people are waiting for mental health treatment?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, we've injected record sums to expand the number of mental health treatments in our country. But, Mr. Speaker, I talked about the practical things that we are doing with CDCs and surgical hubs. But he doesn't also seem to realise that the union action that he fails to condemn and that his members of parliament support from the picket lines have led to several 100,000 cancelled appointments, all making waiting lists worse. And he asked about Wales, but we can look at it. In Wales, over 70,000 people are waiting over 18 months for treatment, compared to in England, where, thanks to our efforts, we have virtually eliminated 18 months' wait. And that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker. He wants to play politics, we get things done.
So raising the waiting list by 500,000 is getting things done. He's through the looking glass, this one. I asked the Prime Minister how many people are waiting for mental health treatment. He knows the answer, he just doesn't want to give it. 1.2 million. 200,000 are children, some waiting nearly 2 years to be seen. Would the Prime Minister accept those kind of delays if it were one of his family or friends?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the key things we are doing to bring down waiting lists is to expand the access of patient choice. It's a very straightforward idea to make sure that patients can choose where they get treated, and that way we will bring down waiting lists for mental health and other treatments far faster. Now, the Labour Party's policy on this is a total and utter mess. First, he promised, in his words, to ban NHS use of the independent sector. Then he said he wants more use of the independent sector. His shadow health secretary agreed with that, but then the deputy leader said that she would end it. As ever, you simply don't know what they stand for, and you can't trust a word they say.
As ever, no responsibility for the shocking state of the NHS. The truth is the Prime Minister would not accept those waits for his family, and neither should anyone else. This morning I spoke to an NHS nurse. For many months, Cam struggled to find time to see her 14-year-old son, Mikey, until he became seriously unwell. And now he hasn't been able to be in mainstream education for over a year. Mikey's mum is having to balance nursing with caring and being a parent. And this isn't a one-off. There are families up and down the country in exactly the same situation, working hard, trying to get through the cost of living crisis whilst desperately worried about relatives who can't get the treatment they need. How does he think they feel when they see the Prime Minister refusing to take responsibility and boasting that everything is fine?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing absolutely everything we can to put money into the NHS to bring down the waiting list, because I do want families up and down the country to have access to the healthcare that they need. He's absolutely right, they do deserve it. But then it is incredibly galling, Mr. Speaker, to hear this from someone who, when there are strikes happening in our hospitals and people are being denied access to emergency medical care, not only does he not have the strength to condemn it, he refuses to back legislation that would guarantee all the families that he talked about that access.
This is on his watch. It's his responsibility. 13 years in, and all he's got to offer is trying to blame the opposition for his failures. Over and over again. Mikey's mum, I'll tell you what Mikey's mum said to me this morning, shall I, if you're so interested to hear. She said, and I'm going to quote her, she said, whatever spin the government puts on it, you can't hide the reality for ordinary working people. That's her words. Worth reflecting on. Yes. Now, I'm glad that in recent years, real progress has been made in tackling the stigma surrounding mental health. But the fact remains that the suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds has doubled since 2010, and suicide is now the biggest killer of men under 45. And they're not just statistics. Every single one is a tragic loss to families and to friends. Politics has the ability to turn this around. It means tough choices. If we were to scrap tax loopholes, we could have thousands more staff, more support in our schools, more support in our communities. That would allow us to treat patients on time, getting them back to work, back to their families, and, crucially, giving them their lives back. This is about mental health. That's Labour's plan. Will he back it?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was this government that, for the first time in the NHS's history, ensured that it had a long-term workforce plan, providing it with record funding so that we can eliminate long waits, but also ensuring that it has the money that it needs to train record numbers of doctors and nurses, whilst radically reforming how they work to improve productivity, because the only way we will get everyone the treatment that they need is to make sure that the NHS has a fantastic staff that it needs, and it's this government that has put that in place. And we can look, because he talks about records, Mr. Speaker, because this is something that no government has done in the past. It's something I'm proud we've done. Labour's record on this issue is clear. It was a disastrous failure of workforce planning. And those weren't my words, Mr. Speaker. Those was the verdict of the Labour-chaired Health Select Committee. It was Labour that did not train the consultants that we would need now, that take 13, 14, 15 or years to train. And it's this government that is for the first time making sure that every family will finally have the doctors and nurses that they need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Access to housing that local people can afford is the biggest challenge we face in Cornwall. And whilst we need to build more houses, we need to ensure that they are available and affordable to local people and meet the needs of our rural and coastal communities. Now, local knowledge, particularly from elected representatives, is an important part in ensuring we achieve this. Yet the Leader of the Opposition has made clear that his intention is to ignore or override the views of local people in decisions on planning matters. Can the Prime Minister assure me and the people of Cornwall that under his government, the views of local communities will play a part in the planning process?
I thank my honourable friend for his excellent campaigning on behalf of his constituents, and I agree with him that housing must meet the needs of local communities, and our Affordable Homes programme is delivering hundreds of thousands of homes across the country. But crucially, on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we believe that local communities must be consulted. In contrast to Labour's plan, which is top-down housing targets, concreting over the Greenbelt and destroying our precious countryside.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think all of us in the Chamber are united in our relief at reports that hostages are due to be released by Hamas in Gaza. But we can't afford to lose sight of what comes at the other side of the temporary pause in hostilities that we are about to see. At the end of 4 days, do we simply see the return to the killing of children in Gaza every 10 minutes? Or do we choose in this House to instead back a permanent ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do welcome the agreement reached overnight. And as I said, this is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial first step as we try and resolve this situation and, indeed, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Of course, we want to see all hostages released as quickly as possible, including British nationals, and I would urge all parties involved to deliver the agreement in full. I would also like to put on record my thanks to Qatar for their important role, and we will continue to work with the United States and Israel to ensure the safe return of hostages and maximise the opportunity of this temporary pause to step up aid to suffering civilians in Gaza. It is something that we have pushed for, we've continued to do, and the UK is playing a leading role in delivering.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, ultimately it's not a pause in the killing of children that we need. It is an end to the killing of children that we need. And I can think of no better time than now for the Prime Minister to advocate for that permanent ceasefire. But given that he won't currently do that, will he instead lay the foundations for that two-state solution by finally recognising the state of Palestine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually what the agreement that has been reached demonstrates that it wasn't right to have a unilateral ceasefire, and what was right was to do, as we have done, consistently push for a pause that would allow not just for aid to reach people in Gaza who desperately need it, but also for hostages to be released. That is what we have pushed for, and I'm glad that that is now being delivered versus a unilateral ceasefire, which would have emboldened and strengthened Hamas. And our position on the Middle East peace process more broadly is clear. We do support a negotiated settlement leading to a safe and secure Israel living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. I've spoken to President Abbas and met with him to discuss this issue, and we are clear about strengthening the Palestinian Authority and reinvigorating efforts to find a two-state solution. And our long-standing position is that we would recognise the state of Palestine when it best serves the interests of peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's Network North project which will see the full £1.7 billion put into the Midlands Rail Hub, which will reopen the central platforms at Kings Norton train station, which have been derelict for so long. And can I ask him to bring forward the cash so we can increase capacity on the line and improve journey times? And can he look at my campaign to extend the new Camp Hill line to Longbridge, which will open up access to the new Longbridge Business Park, which he visited earlier in the year, which will be bringing back manufacturing jobs to Longbridge for the first time since MG collapsed in 2005.
Well, I am pleased that my honourable friend's constituency will benefit from the decision on HS2 and benefit significantly from new Network North funding, an additional £1 billion to deliver the Midlands Rail Hub in full. And I know that decisions about Kings Norton are due to be made later this year, which should be good news to him. And the extension of the forthcoming Camp Hill line services between Birmingham and Kings Norton and Longridge will be assessed in due course as well. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm sure the Rail Minister keeps him up to date on progress.
Sybil Roberts.
All right, I'm sure the Prime Minister will join me and the communities that I represent in sending heartfelt sympathies to the families and friends grieving at the loss of 4 young men lost in a tragic accident in Carrick, Glenrothan this week. People in North Wales pay the highest standing charges on energy bills at £340 a year. That's a third more than London. That's despite having lower average incomes and people there living in older, poorly insulated houses. With a further increase in standing charges due next April, he must recognise that he can't leave this to Ofgem. Will his government, therefore, tackle unfair standing charges, and that before winter sets in?
Mr. Speaker, we have provided an extraordinary package of support for households across the country to help with energy bills, totalling almost £100 billion over the past year or two. The Ofgem price cap has also fallen to around £1,800 currently, and our price guarantee will remain in place till spring of next year, which will provide further protection for families. But crucially, the Chancellor announced previously that we have removed the premium paid by households using prepayment meters until the EPG ends, bringing their costs into line with those paid by comparable direct debit customers, and we continue to provide considerable support for vulnerable families throughout the winter with their energy bills.
Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Setting strategic aims for the Middle East requires us to be precise about the terms we use, and that includes the word peace. Peace is not just the absence of war or conflict, but the freedom from the fear of conflict or oppression or terror. Peace requires mutual respect, freedom from persecution, and living without fear of destitution. It comes with self-determination and liberation from arbitrary justice. It needs hope and dignity and enforceable rights. Does my right honourable friend agree that only when all the people of the Middle East can achieve all of these things can any of us talk about having achieved peace?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with my right honourable friend and thank him for what he says. And I know his advice will continue to be of value to the government as we find a way for a peaceful, more secure future for everyone living in the region.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish surcharge on energy, according to Ofgem, means that people in Scotland pay 50% more in standing charges than Londoners, despite exporting 3.2 million hours of electricity to England in the last 2 months alone. Meanwhile, Scottish green energy producers pay higher charges than English power companies to connect to the grid. Does the Prime Minister think that this is fair to Scotland's consumers and businesses?
Mr. Speaker, I refer to my previous answer about the considerable support that we're providing to families across the United Kingdom with their energy bills. And actually, what would be good, she mentioned Scottish businesses, what would be good is if the SNP realised that they should support the 200,000 people employed in Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The latest film from Torquay's Unleashed theatre company, 3 Steps, outlines the impact of homelessness. What further steps does the government plan to take in order to ensure everyone has a place of their own?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for highlighting the important work of his local theatre company Unleashed, and I wish them well in their future endeavours. We are investing an unprecedented £2 billion over the next 3 years to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping, including building thousands of move-on homes and implementing our landmark Homelessness Reduction Act, which has already prevented or relieved almost 600,000 households from suffering from homelessness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah.
Why are 34% of children in my constituency living in poverty?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's this government that has ensured that across our country 1.7 million fewer people are living in poverty as a result of the actions of this government. Yes, that is true, Mr. Speaker. Not only that, hundreds of thousands fewer children are living in poverty, and income inequality is at a lower level than we inherited from the party opposite. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't want any child to grow up in poverty, and the best way to make sure that that happens is to ensure that they do not grow up in a workless household. And that is why the right strategy is to ensure that we provide as many children with the opportunity to grow up with parents in work. And because of the actions of previous governments, several 100,000 more families are in that.
Got it. Durham Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question about apprenticeships. It is vital that individuals of any age can train and retrain for good local jobs, further education and skills opportunities that are available. So will the Prime Minister work with me in my campaign to establish an apprenticeship hub in Broxton?
Thank my honourable friend for all his campaigning on this important issue. We've delivered over 9,000 apprenticeships in his constituency, of great local businesses, including some that I visited as Chancellor, like Hair and Beauty from memory. But while we continue to invest in apprenticeships, we know the party opposite now want to halve that number, and that is the difference between us. Whilst on this side of the House we want to give people a hand up, all Labour want to do is keep them in their place.
Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With 316 arrivals by small boat this week, last week's Supreme Court ruling on Rwanda has left this government's lack of a compassionate and functioning asylum system totally exposed, with refugees suffering as a result and chaos at our borders. So could I ask the Prime Minister, yes or no, does he now intend to disapply human rights laws in order to continue wasting time and money on this cruel and discredited gimmick?
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the honourable gentleman mentioned the small boats arrivals. I'm pleased to tell him that thanks to the actions of this government, the number of arrivals are down by over 33% so far this year. No thanks to the party opposite that has opposed each and every single measure we have taken to stop the boats.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the Labour leadership at Kirklees Council are looking to close Colne Valley Leisure Centre, hike up car parking charges and being criticised by their auditors for the way in which they manage their resources, there has been lots of good news for my bit of Yorkshire this week. £64 million of levelling up cash for Huddersfield Market and the Penistone rail line upgrade and the West Yorkshire Investment Zone, focusing on the National Health Innovation Campus at the University of Huddersfield. Will the Prime Minister continue to invest in West Yorkshire and come and see some of these fantastic...
Prime Minister!
Well, Mr. Speaker, what great news. What great news. I was delighted to hear that the third investment zone was announced in West Yorkshire, and indeed money for the Penistone Line rail upgrade and regeneration funding for Huddersfield Open Market. My honourable friend is right, though. While the Labour-run Kirklees Council is not investing in closing things, it's this Conservative government that is backing communities across the north.
He's not Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the government's chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, told the COVID inquiry that the now Prime Minister had not asked for advice regarding Eat Out to Help Out. But on the 9th of March 2 years ago, the Prime Minister told this House that, and I quote, "At all steps in the crisis, we have taken the advice of our scientific advisors." Who's right?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, there is an ongoing statutory inquiry into COVID. It's absolutely right that that process is followed. I look forward to providing my own evidence in the coming weeks and addressing all these questions. But it was the case that the government took advice from scientific advisors, and again, that's exactly what this inquiry will go over.
Mr. Speaker, since I recently shared my own experience of birth trauma in this chamber, I've been inundated with mums writing to me from across the UK to share their stories. I received a concerning email last week from a Staffordshire mother who'd like me to raise her concerns about Royal Stoke University Hospital. She also experienced birth trauma and has been told that due to the time elapsed, they will not be able to investigate her concerns. It is not acceptable to me that my constituents are not having complaints investigated by my local hospital. So can I ask the Prime Minister to urgently meet with me to discuss this? And can I also ask him to include birth trauma in the refreshed update to the Women's Health Strategy? We must do better to provide aftercare to all mothers in this country.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue and for continuing to be a fantastic campaigner on birth trauma. I'm pleased that the first ever debate in Parliament on birth trauma was held recently in October. It was powerful, it was moving, and it highlighted just what a significant impact birth trauma can have on so many women's lives. The Department for Health are working with NHS England to make sure that we can improve maternity care and making sure that mental health care is also improved to deal with this. And I will ensure that the Health Secretary meets with my honourable friend so that we can ensure that we get this right for all the women who are depending on it.
Mr. Speaker, in the last 13 years, the 6 oil and gas licensing rounds by the Tories have produced only 16 days' worth of oil and gas for the UK. Can the Prime Minister explain how doubling the number of licensing rounds will have any impact on the insanely high energy bills my constituents are facing? If he cared about energy security, jobs or the environment, he would surely be better matching the Scottish Government's £500 million investment in a just transition and providing a £400 rebate to bill payers.
Mr. Speaker, not £500 million, we're investing tens of billions of pounds in the energy transition, not least with things like carbon capture and storage, which the North Sea can play a starring role in. But it's just completely wrong. In order to have energy security, it's right to exploit the resources that we have here at home. Even the Independent Committee for Climate Change projects that we will still need oil and gas as we make the transition and in decades' time. So the question from the Honourable Lady is, are we better off getting that here at home, supporting Scottish jobs and businesses, or are we better off putting that money in the hands of foreign dictators and shipping it here with 2 or 3 times the carbon emissions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'm hosting 14 Ukrainian teenage children here in the House of Commons, whose parents have been and are fighting the Russians in Ukraine. 6 of them have been orphaned. They are up in the gallery, but they will also be in the IPU room from 1 till 2:30 this afternoon. So I know it's a busy and important day, but all colleagues are welcome to drop by if they are able. So will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to the parents of these children and take this opportunity to reiterate our steadfast support for the people of Ukraine in their fight for their independence, their freedom and their nation's survival?
Well, I do join my honourable friend in paying tribute to the parents of these children and many others, but also to take the opportunity to say that whilst events in the Middle East have been dominating the headlines, I can assure my honourable friend that we and our allies are steadfast in our resolve to support Ukraine for as long as it takes for them to achieve victory. And that's why the Foreign Secretary visited both Kyiv and Odessa last week, confirmed the UK's continued unwavering support for the Ukraine. Putin cannot hope to outlast the incredible resolve or spirit of the Ukrainian people, and they should continue to have our support for as long as it takes.
A few weeks ago, the world cringed at the Prime Minister's fawning welcome for Elon Musk.
Yep.
And this week, advertisers are fleeing Musk's platform after his latest vile outburst. So what exactly did the Prime Minister think he might learn from an unelected, super-rich individual who'd taken over a once successful organisation and plunged it into a death spiral?
Mr. Speaker, it is striking. It is striking from the honourable member from Cambridge, of all places, to absolutely not understand the importance of technology sectors and companies to the growth of our economy. Absolutely extraordinary. It actually illustrates everything that is wrong with Labour's approach to our economy, Mr. Speaker. What the rest of the world saw was the UK playing a lead in defining the regulations and approach to a technology that is going to transform how we live. It was a great example of the UK leading the way, an enormous tribute to our incredible entrepreneurs and businesses, many of which are being poorly represented by him and his constituents.
Today is Red Wednesday, when we remember millions of Christians and others worldwide persecuted for their faith. People like Margaret Atta, a nurse, a lovely young mother of 4, here today from Nigeria, who hid behind the altar as her church service was attacked. 100 were injured, 41 killed that day simply for being in church. Margaret lost both legs and an eye. And thousands more suffer similarly in Nigeria each year. So does the Prime Minister agree that the best way we could honour Red Wednesday today is to commit to quickly implementing the good words of the new International Development White Paper published yesterday to ensure UK development policies going forward are inclusive of those marginalised for their religion or beliefs?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for her continuing dedication as my special envoy for this vital issue. Red Wednesday is an important moment to demonstrate our solidarity with Christians and all those persecuted around the world for their religion or belief. And marking this event annually was just one of the recommendations in the Bishop's report. And I'm pleased that today we will light up FCDO buildings in the UK in red in support. And I'm also pleased to say that we've taken forward all 22 recommendations in a way that we believe is making a real change for those persecuted for their religion or belief.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
That's the end of Prime Minister's questions. Here's Jeremy Hunt.
Before I call the Chancellor, it may help the House if I set out how proceedings on the autumn statement will unfold. Once the Chancellor has delivered his statement, copies of the resolutions relating to the statement will be made available in the Vote Office and online. I will then call the Shadow Chancellor and other honourable members to ask questions. This will follow the usual pattern for a ministerial statement. At the end of questions on the statement, the Chancellor will be called to move a motion under Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968. The question on this motion must be put without debate. We will then proceed to do the debate on the autumn statement resolutions. A minister will move the first of the resolutions and open the debate. Debate will take place over 3 days, concluding on Monday. At the end of the debate on Monday, the question on the first of the resolutions will be disposed of, and the questions on the remaining resolutions will then be taken formally without further debate. I now call the Chancellor to make the autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, I come today with good news. It's my wife's birthday, and unlike me, she's looking younger every year. I turn to the statement. After a global pandemic and energy crisis, we have taken difficult decisions to put our economy back on track. We've supported families with rising bills, cut borrowing and halved inflation. Rather than a recession, the economy has grown. Rather than falling as predicted, real incomes have risen. Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done. Others proposed a more short-term approach, but we have not made unaffordable pay offers to the unions. We have not stopped new oil and gas exploration, and we have not increased borrowing by £28 billion a year. That would have pushed inflation up just when we need to bring it down. Instead, under this Prime Minister, we take decisions for the long term. In today's autumn statement for growth, our choice is not big government, high spending and high tax, because we know that leads to less growth, not more. Instead, we reduce debt,
cut taxes and reward work. We deliver world-class education. We build domestic sustainable energy. And we back British business with 110 growth measures. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all. But, well, I will if you like. But in summary, Mr. Speaker, they remove planning red tape, they speed up access to the national grid, they support entrepreneurs raising capital, they get behind our fastest growing industries, they unlock foreign direct investment, they boost productivity, they reform welfare, they level up opportunity to every corner of the country, and they cut business taxes. The Office for Budget Responsibility say that the combined impact of these measures will raise business investment, get more people into work, reduce inflation next year and increase GDP. But Conservatives also know that a dynamic economy depends on the energy and enterprise of people more than any diktats or decisions by ministers. So today's measures do not just remove barriers to investment, they reward effort and work. And I'll go through the measures in three parts. In the first, I'll use updated OBR forecasts to show the progress we're making against the Prime Minister's economic priorities. The second part sets out growth measures to back British business. Finally, I conclude with measures to make work pay. Before I start with the forecasts, I want to express my horror at the murderous attack on Israeli citizens on October the 7th and the subsequent loss of life on both sides. I will remember for the rest of my life, as I know many other honourable members will, being taken to Auschwitz by Rabbi Barry Marcus and the remarkable Holocaust Educational Trust. But I'm deeply concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in our country. So I'm announcing up to £7 million over the next 3 years for organisations like the Holocaust Education Trust to tackle anti-Semitism in schools and universities. I will also repeat the £3 million uplift to the Community Security Trust. When it comes to anti-Semitism and all forms of racism, we must never allow the clock to be turned back. I now move on to the OBR's economic and fiscal forecasts. And I thank Richard Hughes and his team for their sterling work in preparing them. Three of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's 5 pledges at the start of the year were economic: to halve inflation, grow the economy and reduce debt. Today I can report to the House that we are delivering on all 3. Let's start with inflation. Now, the Shadow Chancellor didn't mention it in her conference speech. My conference speech was before hers, so all she had to do was a bit of copying and pasting, which I've heard she's good at. But it speaks volumes that during the worst global inflation shock for a generation, it didn't even get a mention. Well, if controlling inflation isn't a priority for Labour, it is for us. When the Prime Minister and I took office, inflation was 11.1%. Last week it fell to 4.6%. We promised to halve inflation and we have halved it. Core inflation is now lower than in nearly half the economies in the EU, and the OBR say that headline inflation will fall to 2.8% by the end of 2024 before falling to the 2% target in 2025. I will not take risks with inflation, and the OBR confirm that the measures I take today make inflation lower next year than it would otherwise have been. I thank the Independent Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee for their crucial role in bringing inflation down, and we will continue to back them to do whatever it takes until the job is done. But as we do, we will continue to support families in difficulty. And today I add 4 further measures to help with the cost of living. Firstly, for those on the lowest incomes, I understand the concerns some have about the effect on work incentives of matching benefit increases to inflation. I know there's been some speculation that we would increase benefits next year by the lower October figure for inflation. But cost of living pressures remain at their most acute for the poorest families. So instead, the government has decided to increase universal credit and other benefits from next April by 6.7% in line with September's inflation figure, an average increase of £470 for 5.5 million households next year. Vital support to those on the very lowest incomes from a compassionate Conservative government. Second, because rent can constitute more than half the living costs of private renters on the lowest incomes, I've listened closely to many colleagues, as well as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Resolution Foundation, Citizens Advice UK, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who said that unfreezing the local housing allowance was an urgent priority. I will therefore increase the local housing allowance rate to the 30th percentile of local market rents. This will give 1.6 million households an average of £800 of support next year. Third, although I'm going to increase duty on hand-rolling tobacco by an additional 10% above the tobacco duty escalator, I know that for many people, going to the pub has become more expensive. I've listened closely to the persuasive arguments on alcohol duties from my honourable friend for Murray and my right honourable friend for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweedsdale, fierce champions of the Scotch whisky industry. I've also listened to defenders of the great British pint, such as my right honourable friends for the Vale of Glamorgan and Buckingham. In my own constituency, to Councillor Jane Austen, who is a big supporter of the Jolly Farmer pub in Bramley, and indeed to the Sun newspaper. So, as well as confirming our Brexit pubs guarantee, which means the duty on a pint is always lower than in the shops, I have decided to freeze all alcohol duty until August the 1st next year. That means no increase in duty on beer, cider, wine or spirits. Finally, pensioners. The triple lock has helped lift 250,000 older people out of poverty since it was instituted by a Conservative government in 2011. It's been a lifeline for many during a period of high inflation. There have been reports that we would uprate it by a lower amount to smooth out the effect of high public sector bonuses in July, but that would have been particularly difficult for 1 million pensioners whose only income is from the state. So instead, today, we honour our commitment to the triple lock in full. From April 24, we will increase the full new state pension by 8.5% to £221.20 a week, worth up to £900 more a year. This is one of the largest ever cash increases to the state pension, showing a Conservative government will always back our pensioners. Including today's measures, our total commitment to easing cost of living pressures has risen to £104 billion. That includes paying around half the cost of the average energy bill since last October, and amounts now to an average of £3,700 per household. We are able to do that only because we reduced the deficit by 80% ahead of the pandemic, which the party opposite might reflect on, having opposed us every step of the way. Next, I turn to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's pledge to reduce debt. Before I took difficult decisions in last year's autumn statement, debt was predicted to rise to almost 100% of GDP by the end of the forecast. Since then, the economy has outperformed expectations, and I've taken difficult decisions to reduce borrowing. As a result, headline debt is now predicted to be 94% of GDP by the end of the forecast. The OBR today forecast underlying debt will be 91.6% of GDP next year, 92.7% in 24-5, 93.2% in 26-7, before declining in the final 2 years of the forecast to 92.8% in 28-29. That is lower in every year compared to forecasts in the spring. We therefore meet our fiscal rule to have underlying debt falling as a percentage of GDP in the final year of the forecast, with double the headroom compared to the OBR's March forecast. And we will continue to have the second lowest government debt in the G7, lower than the United States, Canada, France, Italy or Japan. I turn to borrowing. The Right Honourable Lady opposite said when it comes to borrowing, she will take it up to £28 billion a year. Take it up, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, she has opposed every decision we have made to reduce our borrowing. But, Mr. Speaker, this side of the House will bring borrowing down because, as the late Lord Lawson said, borrowing is just a deferred tax on future generations. Now, I see the Leader of the Opposition shaking his head. In fact, we do have something in common. Both he and I wanted to make a Jeremy Prime Minister. In fairness, his party and mine are probably equally relieved we failed. But whereas this Jeremy is growing the economy, his Jeremy would have crashed it. And the numbers... And the numbers show the contrast. According to the OBR, borrowing is lower this year and next, and on average across the forecast by 0.7 billion every year compared to the spring budget forecast. It falls from 4.5% of GDP in 23-24 to 3%, 2.7%, 2.3%, 1.6% and 1.1% in 28-29. That means we also meet our second fiscal rule, that public sector borrowing must be below 3% of GDP, not just by the final year, but in almost every year of the forecast. Some of this improvement is from higher tax receipts from a stronger economy, but we also maintain a disciplined approach to public spending. As I set out in the spring budget, resource spending will increase by 1% a year from 25.6 in real terms, and we are sustaining the record 2020 increase in capital spending in cash terms until the end of the forecast. Within this, we will meet our NATO commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence, critical at a time of global threats to the international order, most notably from Putin's evil war in Ukraine. We also support a group of people to whom we owe our freedom, our brave veterans. I will extend national insurance relief for employers of eligible veterans for a further year and provide £10 million to support the Veterans, Places, Pathways and People programme, and I thank our excellent Veterans Minister for his championing of their cause. We have shown that we are prepared to increase funding for vital public services, with record numbers of police officers, doctors, nurses and teachers. We're nearly doubling the numbers of doctors and nurses we train, having given the NHS its first ever long-term workforce plan, as I promised to do a year ago. We're also tackling the biggest single preventable cause of mortality the NHS has to deal with by bringing forward plans for a smoke-free generation. But alongside extra funding and support, we need to see reform. We need a more productive state, not a bigger state. And that is why I want the public sector to increase productivity growth by at least 0.5% a year, the level at which the size of our state starts to reduce as a proportion of GDP. I've already announced plans to cap and reduce the size of the civil service to pre-pandemic levels. Today, I pay tribute to my friend, the former Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the Right Honourable Member for Salisbury, who started our brilliant public sector productivity programme. It will now be pursued by his formidable successor, the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks, who has already been with me to meet police, fire and ambulance personnel to understand why bureaucracy is holding them back. And through this vital work, we will ensure that over time, the growth in public spending is lower than the growth in the economy, whilst always protecting the services the public value. And I will also provide HMRC with the resources they need to ensure everyone pays the tax they owe, raising an additional £5 billion across the forecast period. My right honourable friend also promised to grow the economy. Since 2010, despite inheriting what was then the worst recession since the Second World War, Conservative administrations have presided over faster growth than many of our major competitors, including Spain, Italy, France. Well, they don't like to hear this, but let me tell them the list. Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Netherlands, Austria, Germany, Japan. We've grown faster than all of them since 2010. But all those countries have faced a pandemic and an energy shock. And as a result, last autumn, the OBR forecast a recession in which the economy was forecast to shrink by 1.4% this year. Instead, it grew. In fact, it's grown faster than the euro area. Revised numbers from the ONS now say the economy is 1.8% larger than pre-pandemic. And looking ahead, the OBR expects the economy to grow by 0.6% this year and 0.7% next. After that, growth rises to 1.4% in 25, then 1.9%, 2%, and 1.7% in 28. If we want those numbers to be higher, we need higher productivity. The private sector is more productive in countries like the United States, Germany, and France because it invests more, on average 2 percentage points more of GDP every year. The 110 measures I take today help close that gap by boosting business investment by £20 billion a year. They do not involve borrowing more and ramping up debt, as some advocate. Instead, they unlock investment with supply-side reforms that back British business in the following areas. First, skills. No economy can prosper without investing in the potential of its people. Despite strong opposition, we took difficult decisions to reform our schools. England's 9 to 10-year-olds are now the 4th best readers in the world. And since 2015, our 15 to 16-year-olds have risen 7 places in the OECD rankings for maths, not least thanks to the efforts of the brilliant Right Honourable Member for Bognor Regis and Littlehampton. But 9 million adults in England still have low basic literacy or numeracy skills. So last month, the Prime Minister set out the new Advanced British Standard to ensure all school leavers reach minimum standards in maths and English. And while the party opposite wants to reduce the number of apprentices, we want to increase them. So, following engagement with Make UK and others, I'm announcing a further £50 million of funding over the next 2 years to pilot ways to increase the number of apprentices in engineering and other key growth sectors where there are shortages. Next, planning. It takes too long. There's 110 of these measures, so just be patient, folks. I move on to planning. It takes too long to approve infrastructure projects and business planning applications. Many businesses say they would be willing to pay more if they knew their application would be approved faster. So from next year, working with the Community Secretary, I will reform the system to allow local authorities to recover the full costs of major business planning applications in return for being required to meet guaranteed faster timelines. If they fail, fees will be refunded automatically with the application being processed free of charge. A prompt service or your money back, just as would be the case in the private sector. Now, many planning applications are for house building. The leader of the opposition told us he wanted to be a builder, not a blocker. It didn't last long. Just a few months later, Labour blocked reforms to the rules on nutrient neutrality, shamelessly preventing 100,000 houses from being built. Conservatives, on the other hand, are the builders, with more homes being completed in 21-22 than any single year of the last Labour government. And today we take further decisions to unlock the building of more homes. We'll invest £110 million over this year and next to deliver high-quality nutrient mitigation schemes, unlocking 40,000 homes. We'll invest £32 million to bust the planning backlog and develop fantastic new housing quarters in Cambridge, London and Leeds, which will lead to many thousands of additional dwellings. We'll allocate £450 million to the Local Authority Housing Fund to deliver 2,400 new homes, and we'll consult on a new permitted development right to allow any house to be converted into 2 flats, provided the exterior remains unaffected. It's also taking too long for clean energy businesses to access the electricity grid. So after talking to businesses such as National Grid, Octopus Energy and SSE, we today publish our full response to the Windsor Review and Connections Action Plan. These measures will cut grid access delays by 90% and offer up to £10,000 off electricity bills over 10 years for those living closest to new transmission infrastructure. Taking together, these planning and grid reforms are estimated to accelerate around £90 billion of additional business investment over the next 10 years. Next, foreign direct investment. I'm extremely grateful to Lord Harrington for his excellent report on how to increase foreign direct investment. We accept all his headline recommendations, and in particular will put in place a concierge service for large international investors, modelled on the best such services offered by our competitors, and will increase funding for the Office for Investment to deliver it. I now turn to reforms to pension funds that will increase the flow of capital going to our most promising growth companies in a way that also improves outcomes for savers. I'll take forward my Mansion House reforms, starting with measures to consolidate the industry. By 2030, the majority of workplace DC savers will have their pension pots managed in schemes over 30 billion, and by 2040, all local government pension funds will be invested in pools of 200 billion or more. I'll support the establishment of investment vehicles for pension funds to use, including through the LIFTS competition, a new growth fund run by the British Business Bank, and opening the PPF as an investment vehicle for smaller DB pension schemes. I will also consult on giving savers a legal right to require a new employer to pay pension contributions into their existing pension pot if they choose, meaning people can move to having one pension pot for life. These reforms could unlock an extra £75 billion of financing for high-growth companies by 2030 and provide an extra £1,000 a year in retirement for an average earner saving from 18. Alongside this, I'm also proposing further capital market reforms to boost the attractiveness of our markets and make sure the UK remains one of the most attractive places to start, grow and list a company. And as part of this, I will explore options for a NatWest retail share offer in the next 12 months, subject to market conditions and achieving value for money. It's time to get Sid investing again. Yeah. Next, I move on to measures to support our most innovative industries. In the last decade, under Conservatives, we have grown to become the 3rd largest technology sector in the world, double the size of Germany, 3 times the size of France, the biggest life science industry in Europe, Europe's 3rd largest generator of renewable electricity after Germany and Norway, and the 8th largest manufacturer in the world. When it comes to tech, we know that AI will be at the heart of any future growth. I want to make sure our universities, scientists and startups can access the compute power they need. So building on the success of the supercomputing centres in Edinburgh and Bristol, I'll invest a further £500 million over the next 2 years to fund further innovation centres to help make us an AI powerhouse. Our creative industries already support Europe's largest film and TV sector. This year's all-Californian blockbuster Barbie was filmed in the constituency of the Honourable Member for Watford, where, of course, the sun always shines. I know that even more could be invested in visual effects if we increase the generosity of the film and high-end TV tax credits, so I'll today launch a call for evidence on how to make that happen. British-discovered vaccines and treatments saved more lives across the world during the pandemic than those from any other country, and I'm incredibly proud of our life sciences industry. To further support research and development, I'm creating a new simplified R&D tax relief, combining the existing R&D expenditure credit and SME schemes. I'll also reduce the rate at which loss-making companies are taxed within the merged scheme from 25% to 19%, and lower the threshold for the additional support for R&D intensive loss-making SMEs that I announced in the spring to 30%, benefiting a further 5,000 SMEs. And because 2028 marks the centenary of the invention of penicillin by Alexander Fleming, I'm giving £5 million to Imperial College and Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust to set up a Fleming Centre to inspire the next generation of world-changing innovations. For our advanced manufacturing and green energy sectors, international investors say the biggest thing we could do is to announce a longer-term strategy for their industries. So with the Secretaries of State for Business and Trade and Energy Security and Net Zero, I'm today publishing those plans. I confirm that we'll make available £4.5 billion of support over the 5 years to 2030 to attract investment into strategic manufacturing sectors. That includes support of £2 billion for zero-emission investments in the automotive sector, something that's been warmly welcomed by Nissan and Toyota, £975 million for aerospace, building on decades of success from firms like Airbus and Rolls-Royce, and £520 million for life sciences to build on the strength of world-class British pharma companies like AstraZeneca and GSK. We'll also provide £960 million for the new Green Industries Growth Accelerator focused on offshore wind, electricity networks, nuclear, CCUS and hydrogen. These targeted investments will ensure the UK remains competitive in sectors where we're already leaders and innovative in sectors where we're not. And taken together across our fastest growing innovation sectors, this support will attract an estimated £2 billion of additional investment every year over the next decade. One of the reasons we support our manufacturing and clean energy sectors is they help to level up growth across the United Kingdom. So I now turn to further levelling up measures. In the spring, I announced we'd deliver 12 new investment zones, 12 mini Canary Wharfs, where government, industry and research institutes collaborate across the UK. Since then, the Exchequer Secretary, the Honourable Member for Grantham and Stamford, has done outstanding work across government to bring this vision to fruition. Following tenacious representations by the Honourable Member for Innis Mon, without whom a mention would mean that no Chancellor's speech was complete, and representations from the unstoppable Mayor of Tees Valley, I have today decided to extend the financial incentives for investment zones and the tax reliefs for free ports from 5 years to 10 years. I will also set up a £150 million investment opportunity fund to catalyse investment into the programme. Now, on Monday, I confirmed a new investment zone in West Yorkshire. Today, having listened to representations from the West Midlands Salesman-in-Chief Andy Street, as well as the Honourable Member for Mansfield and the Honourable Member for Bury North, I am announcing 3 further investment zones focused on advanced manufacturing in the West Midlands, East Midlands and Greater Manchester. Together, local partners expect these will help catalyse over £3 billion of private investment and 65,000 new jobs. And having listened to the Honourable Member for Wrexham and the Honourable Member for Clwyd South, I can announce a second investment zone in Wales in the fantastic region of Wrexham and Flintshire, which I will visit tomorrow. We're publishing new devolution deals with 4 areas, including Hull and East Yorkshire, and offering devolved powers to even more county areas. One of those areas will be the leafiest and most charming county in the country, namely Surrey, where, of course, the Leader of the Opposition grew up. We don't get everything right. On Monday, we saw the announcement of £1 billion of funding through round 3 of the Levelling Up Fund, supporting projects following the campaigning efforts of the members for Keighley, Dewsbury, Doncaster, Scunthorpe, and of course, Mr. Speaker, Chorley. I can also confirm that we will proceed with over £50 million of funding for high-quality regeneration projects in communities such as Bolsover, Monmouthshire, Warrington and Eden Valley, all of which have particularly effective local MPs as their champions. And because we are proudly the Conservative and Unionist Party, I'm announcing £80 million for the new Levelling Up partnerships in Scotland, £500,000 to support the Hay Festival in Wales, and £3 million of additional funding to support the successful Tackling Paramilitarism programme in Northern Ireland. Next, small business. I ran my own one for 14 years, and I've always known that every big business was a small business once. The Federation of Small Businesses say the biggest thing I could do to help their members is end the scourge of late payments. The Procurement Act we've passed means that the 30-day payment terms, which are already set for public sector contracts, will automatically apply throughout the subcontract supply chain. But from April 24, I'll also introduce a condition that any company bidding for large government contracts should demonstrate they pay their own invoices within an average of 55 days, which will reduce progressively to 30 days. Any small business will also tell you the biggest frustration they have is the tax you pay before making a penny of profit, not least business rates. Now, the government has already taken a third of properties out of rates completely through small business rates relief. We've frozen the tax rate for the last 3 years at a cost of £14.5 billion. We've removed downwards caps from transitional relief. And for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, we've introduced a 1-year 75% discount on business rates up to £110,000. And those measures have saved the average independent shop over £20,000. It's not possible to continue with temporary support measures forever. But whilst the standard multiplier, which applies to high-value properties, will rise in line with inflation, I have today decided that we will freeze the small business multiplier for a further year. And following extensive discussions with the FSB and many colleagues in this House, I've also decided to extend the 75% business rates discount for retail, hospitality and leisure for another year. This will save the average independent pub over £12,800 next year, and at a cost of £4.3 billion is a large tax cut which recognises the role of pubs and high street shops in our communities. I thank the members for Stockton South, Barrow and Furness and East Devon for their tenacious campaigning on this issue. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I turn to the smallest of all businesses, those run by the self-employed. These are the people who literally kept our country running during the pandemic. The plumbers who fixed our boilers in lockdowns, the delivery drivers who bought us our shopping, the farmers who kept food on our plates. As part of our plans to grow the economy, I want to reform and simplify taxes paid by the self-employed. So today I'm announcing a major reform of one of those taxes. It's one most people haven't heard of, but it's a big deal for those who have to pay it. Class 2 national insurance is a flat rate, compulsory charge, currently £3.45 a week, paid by self-employed people earning more than £12,570, which gives state pension entitlement. Today, after careful consideration, and in recognition of the contribution made by self-employed people to our country, I can announce that we are abolishing Class 2 national insurance altogether, saving the average self-employed person £192 a year. Access to entitlements and credits will be maintained in full, and those who choose to pay voluntarily will still be able to do so. But this change simplifies and cuts tax for nearly 2 million self-employed people, whilst protecting the interest of those on the lowest pay. And because we value their work, I'm taking one further step for the self-employed. They also pay Class 4 national insurance at 9% on all earnings between £12,570 and £50,270. Today, I've decided to cut that tax by 1 percentage point to 8% from April. Taken together with the abolition of the compulsory Class 2 charge, these reforms will save around 2 million self-employed people an average of £350 a year from April. Mr. Speaker, we're backing small business by freezing their business rates, extending retail, hospitality and leisure relief, abolishing compulsory Class 2 national insurance payments and reducing Class 4 national insurance by 1 percentage point in today's autumn statement for growth. Small businesses work so hard for us, and a Conservative government today is working hard for them. I turn now to my final measure to back British business, Mr. Speaker. As I said, since 2010, we have seen the second highest growth in investment of any G7 country. However, if we're to raise productivity, we need to increase business investment further. In 2021, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, introduced the super deduction for large businesses to further stimulate business investment. And this spring, I introduced full expensing for 3 years. This means that for every £1 million a company invests, they get £250,000 off their tax bill in the very same year. The CBI, Make UK, the BCC, Energy UK and 200 other business leaders from companies including BT Openreach, Siemens and Bosch have said that making this measure permanent would be the single most transformational thing I could do for business investment and growth. The Centre for Policy Studies say it would maximise business investment, boost productivity and deliver higher levels of GDP. But because it costs £11 billion a year, I made clear that I would only do so when it was affordable. Well, with inflation halved, borrowing down and debt falling, today I deliver on that promise. I will today make full expensing permanent. That is the largest business tax cut in modern British history. It means we have not just the lowest headline corporation tax rate in the G7, but its most generous capital allowances. The OBR say this will increase annual investment by around £3 billion a year and a total of £14 billion over the forecast period. We know on this side of the House the way to back British business is not to borrow more or subsidise more, but to increase the incentives to invest. And we do that today by introducing one of the most generous tax reliefs anywhere in the world, a huge boost to British competitiveness in an autumn statement for growth. Skills, planning, infrastructure reform, pension fund reform, support for innovation industries, levelling up, backing small businesses and full expensing. Under Labour, business investment was 9.3% of GDP in real terms. Since 2010, it's been 9.8% of GDP. But today we go further because taken together, the overall impact of today's growth measures will be to increase business investment in the UK economy by around £20 billion a year within the decade, nearly 1% of GDP at today's level. This is the biggest ever boost for business investment in modern times, a decisive step towards closing the productivity gap with other major economies, and the most effective way we can raise wages and living standards for every family in the country. Now, as well as backing business, Conservatives know you need to back the people without whose effort no business can succeed. The entrepreneur taking risks, the builder working weekends, the nurse working nights, and the job seeker leaving benefits behind. I therefore conclude with 3 further supply-side reforms designed to improve the incentives to work in a modern, dynamic economy. And I begin with welfare, and I want to start by thanking the outstanding Work and Pensions Secretary for his help in developing these reforms. He builds on the work of my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green. who introduced universal credit. Those reforms helped reduce unemployment, which has fallen by over 1 million, but to their shame, the party opposite voted against them 30 times. Because they think compassion is about giving money, we think it's about giving opportunity. But post-pandemic, we still have over 7 million adults of working age, excluding students, who are not working, despite 1 million vacancies in the economy. Many can and want to work, but our system makes that too hard. In the spring budget, I announced 30 hours of free childcare for working parents of 1 to 2-year-olds. That plan, still opposed by the party opposite, starts rolling out in April. It will help tens of thousands of parents return to work without having to worry about damaging their career prospects. Today, we focus on helping those with sickness or disability and the long-term unemployed. Every year, we sign off over 100,000 people onto benefits with no requirement to look for work because of sickness or disability. That waste of potential is wrong economically and wrong morally. So with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, last week I announced our Back to Work plan. We will reform the fit note process so that treatment rather than time off becomes the default. We'll reform the work capability assessment to reflect greater flexibility and availability of home working after the pandemic. And we'll spend £1.3 billion over the next 5 years to help nearly 700,000 people with health conditions find jobs. Over 180,000 more people will be helped through the Universal Support Programme, and nearly 500,000 more people will be offered treatment for mental health conditions and employment support. Over the forecast period, the OBR judged these measures will more than halve the flow of people who are signed off work with no work search requirements. At the same time, we'll provide a further £1.3 billion of funding to offer extra help to the 300,000 people who've been unemployed for over a year without any sickness or disability. But we will ask for something in return. If after 18 months of intensive support, job seekers have not found a job, we'll roll out a programme requiring them to take part in mandatory work placement to increase their skills and improve their employability. And if they choose not to engage with the work search process for 6 months, we will close their case and stop their benefits. Taken together with the labour supply measures I announced in the spring, the OBR say we will increase the number of people in work by around 200,000 at the end of the forecast period, permanently increasing the size of the economy. Now, I know that some on the benches opposite would prefer to fill those vacancies in a different way. They hanker after a more liberal immigration regime, or even dream of bringing back free movement. But Conservatives say we should unlock the potential we have right here at home. And we do that with the biggest set of welfare reforms in a decade in today's autumn statement for growth. Now, Mr. Speaker, if we're to incentivise work, we must also tackle low pay. People who get up early, put in the hours and work hard for their families deserve to be paid fairly. Since 2010, those on the minimum wage, now the national living wage, have seen their hourly wage go up from £5.80 an hour to £10.42 an hour. That's a real terms increase of more than 20%. Because we've also doubled the threshold at which you pay tax or national insurance, their after-tax income has gone up not by 20%, but by 25% more than any other income group. Today, I confirm we'll go further and accept the Low Pay Commission recommendation to increase the national living wage by 9.8% to £11.44 an hour. That is the largest ever cash increase in the national living wage, worth up to £1,800 for a full-time worker. And since the national living wage has been introduced, the proportion of people on low pay, defined as earning less than 2/3 of national median hourly income, has halved, But at the new rate of £11.44 an hour, it delivers our manifesto commitment to eliminate low pay altogether. That means by next year, someone working full-time on the national living wage will see their real take-home after-tax pay go up not by 25%, but by 30% compared to 2010. And that is the difference. The party opposite tried to reduce poverty by tinkering with benefits and tax credits. They wanted to move people from just below the poverty line to just above it. But Conservatives know the best way to tackle poverty is through work. By reforming the welfare system, reducing workless households, and tackling low pay, we have helped lift 1.7 million people out of absolute poverty since 2010, because a central part of our plan for growth is to make work pay. And so, Mr. Speaker, to the final supply-side measure in today's autumn statement for growth. Because of the difficult decisions that we've taken in the last year, today's OBR forecast shows that borrowing will be lower than forecast in the spring. Debt as a proportion of GDP will be lower than forecast in the spring. Inflation will continue to fall, and our fiscal headroom has doubled. I said I would cut taxes when we could, but only responsibly and only in a way that did not fuel inflation. The OBR today confirm I can deliver a package which does that. For businesses, I've today delivered the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, with the most competitive investment allowances of any large economy. For the self-employed, I've simplified and reformed their taxes by abolishing the compulsory Class 2 charge and cutting Class 4 national insurance. But high employment taxes on 27 million people working in the public and private sectors also disincentivise the hard work we should be encouraging. On top of income tax at 20%, they pay 12% national insurance on earnings between £12,570 and £50,270. That is a 32% marginal tax rate. If we want people to get up early in the morning, if we want them to work nights, if we want an economy where people go the extra mile and work hard, then we need to recognise that their hard work benefits us all. So today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to cut the main 12% rate of employee national insurance. If I cut it by 1 percentage point to 11%, that would be an extra £225 in the pockets of the average worker every year. But instead, I'm going to go further and cut the main rate of employee national insurance by 2 percentage points from 12% to 10%. That change will help 27 million people. It means someone on the average salary of £35,000 will save over £450. For the average nurse, it's a saving of £520. For the typical police officer, a saving of £630 every single year. And, Mr. Speaker, I would normally bring in a measure like this from the start of the new tax year in April. But instead, tomorrow, I'm introducing urgent legislation to bring it in from January the 6th. So people can see the benefit in their payslips at the start of the new year. The OBR say reducing a tax on work means more people in work. And they say today's measures will, just on national insurance, will lead to the equivalent of 94,000 full-time employees in our economy, because lower tax means higher growth. And that is the difference between this side and that one. In 13 years, Labour raised taxes in every single budget, but Conservatives cut taxes when we responsibly can. And today we do just that. We cut taxes to help bigger businesses invest. We cut taxes to help smaller businesses grow. We cut taxes for the self-employed who keep our country running. And from January, we cut taxes for 27 million working people whose hard work drives our economy forward. Mr. Speaker, The best universities, the cleverest scientists, the smartest entrepreneurs have given us Europe's most innovative economy. But we can be the most prosperous too. In the face of global challenges, we've halved inflation, reduced our debt and grown our economy. As a country, we're sticking to a plan that's working, and this autumn statement for growth will attract £20 billion additional business investment a year in the next decade, bring tens of thousands of people into work and support our fastest growing industries in a package which leaves borrowing lower, debt lower and keeps inflation falling. We are delivering the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, the largest ever cut to employee and self-employed national insurance, and the biggest package of tax cuts to be implemented since the 1980s. An autumn statement for a country that has turned a corner, an autumn statement for growth, which I commend to the House.
I now call the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Chancellor has lifted the lid on 13 years of economic failure. We were told that this was to be an autumn statement for growth, but the economy is now forecast to be £40 billion smaller by 2027 than the Chancellor said back in March. Growth revised down. Next year, the year after, and the year after that too. The Chancellor claims that the economy has turned a corner, yet the truth is that under the Conservatives, growth has hit a dead end. What has been laid bare today is the full scale of the damage that this government has done to our economy over 13 years. And nothing that has been announced today will remotely compensate. Mortgages rising, taxes eating into wages, inflation high with prices still going up in the shops, public services on their knees, and too many families struggling to make ends meet. As the sun begins to set on this divided, out of touch, weak government, the only conclusion that the British people will reach is this: after 13 years of Conservatives, the economy is simply not working, and despite all the promises today, working people are still worse off. Mr. Speaker, the centrepiece of today's autumn statement is a cut in the headline rate of national insurance. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm old enough to remember when the Prime Minister wanted to put up national insurance. As recently as January last year, he said, and I quote, "We must go ahead with the increase in the health and care levy. It is progressive in that the burden falls most on those who can most afford it." Utter nonsense. It was a tax on working people, and we opposed it for that very reason. Yet again, the Prime Minister is left arguing against himself. In response to last year's autumn statement, I warned that the government was pickpocketing working people through stealth taxes. I have long argued that taxes on working people are too high. Indeed, I said in my conference speech that I want them to be lower. From their failure to uprate income tax or national insurance bans, to forcing councils to raise council tax, the Conservatives have pushed the costs of their failure onto others. But the British people won't be taken for fools. They know that what has been announced today owes more to the cynicism of a party desperate to cling onto power than the real priorities of this high-tax, low-growth Conservative government. So I think that we can forgive taxpayers for not celebrating when they see the truth behind today's announcements. Going into this statement, the government had already put in place tax increases worth the equivalent of a 10p increase in national insurance. So today's 2p cut will not remotely compensate for the tax increases already put in place by this Conservative government. The fact is that taxes will be higher at the next election than they were at the last. This is the legacy of the Conservatives, and that, Mr. Speaker, is their record. Mr. Speaker, The Chancellor and Prime Minister have spent the last 2 weeks marching their MPs up a hill, only to march them down again on inheritance tax. Now, let's not forget, when they realised that they had money to spend...
Kearns, I've had you chirping all the way through. Either go and get yourself that cup of tea or be quiet. Rachel.
When they realised that they had money to spend, this government's first instinct was a tax cut for millionaires. But in the end, even they realised that they couldn't get away with it in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So can the Chancellor tell the House today, is cutting inheritance tax a decision delayed or a decision abandoned? This autumn statement for growth is now the 11th Conservative economic growth plan, from the 5th Prime Minister, the 7th Chancellor and the 9th Business Secretary. And what do those numbers add up to? According to the most recent GDP data, a big, fat zero. That's zero growth in the most recent data in the third quarter of this year. Now, the Chancellor mentioned some countries that we are outperforming in growth, but I couldn't help notice that he failed to mention any of the many advanced economies that have grown faster than the UK. Over the last 13 years of this low-growth Conservative government, the UK languishes in the bottom third of OECD countries when it comes to growth. There are 27 OECD economies that have grown faster than us in the 13 years since 2010, including the US, Australia, Canada, Sweden, Slovenia and 22 others. In fact, over the next 2 years, no fewer than 177 economies are forecast by the IMF to grow faster.
Sorry.
Don't bother me, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, it bothers me. I'm not being funny. I expect the same courtesies to the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. Those who wish to not give that courtesy, please go and find something else to do, because my constituents are interested, yours aren't. Rachel Williams.
And next year, Mr. Speaker, we are forecast to be the slowest growing economy in the whole of the G7. When it comes to economic growth, under the Tories, we are more world-following than world-beating. And let's look at how their record on growth compares to Labour's record on growth. Under the Conservatives, GDP growth has averaged 1.5% per year. But with Labour, it grew an average of 2% a year in the 13 years that we were last in office. Had the economy continued to grow at the rate it did with Labour, it would now be £150 billion bigger. So what is this government's economic record? Lower growth and higher borrowing, with debt more than doubling, now at almost 100% of GDP. This is a product of their failures over 13 years. A Tory government that has failed on growth, failed on debt, failed on levelling up and failed on the cost of living too. And now they expect the British people to believe that when they say they are going to turn it all around, when it is them that is the problem and not the solution. Mr. Speaker, if we are going to grow the economy, we must get more people into work. Let me be clear. People who can work should work. That's why we've long argued that the work capability assessment needs replacing. Because right now it is discouraging people from seeking work. But there's a wider problem that yet again this government is failing to face up to. Britain is the only country in the G7 where the employment rate still has not returned to pre-pandemic levels, with the increase in the number of people out of the workforce due to long-term health issues costing the taxpayer a staggering £15.7 billion a year. NHS waiting lists have swelled to 7.8 million, an additional 500,000 since the Prime Minister said he was going to cut them. And 2.6 million people are out of work due to long-term sickness. A healthy nation is critical to a healthy economy. That's why Labour has pledged to cut hospital waiting lists, investing an additional £1.1 billion a year to deliver 2 million more appointments, scans and operations. It will be funded by abolishing the non-dom tax status and replacing it with a modern scheme for people who are genuinely living in the UK for short periods. But once again, we see that this policy has been vetoed by the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the best way to get people back to work is to get our NHS working, but the reality is you can never trust the Tories with our NHS. Now, the Chancellor has made a great fanfare about public sector efficiency and value for money. This is from a government that has blown £140 million on a discredited Rwanda scheme and yet are not able to send a single asylum seeker there. £7.2 billion money lost on fraud during the pandemic, all those cheques signed up by the former Chancellor, the current Prime Minister. £8.7 billion on PPE that's been written off. HS2 costing £57 billion with not a single piece of track going north of Birmingham. No one can trust the Tories with taxpayers' money. And it says it all that after 13 years of Tory government, there are still nearly 12,000 NHS computers running on outdated software that's vulnerable to cyber attacks. 10 years ago, when he was Health Secretary, the now Chancellor promised a paperless NHS by 2018. Yet today, in 2023, 26 NHS trusts are still using fax machines. Now, why on earth should people who experience deteriorating public services under this Conservative government trust them to fix it, when his 6 years as Health Secretary makes him one of the biggest architects of failure? If you put your hands into people's pockets and take money out of them, and they don't see visible improvements in the services that they receive, they get very angry indeed. Not my words, the Chancellor's words 2 years ago. And I agree with him. The Tories have had 13 years to improve public services, and they have failed. Mr. Speaker, this is too little and too late. I do want to welcome the Chancellor's announcement today of additional funding to tackle anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to keep our communities safe, as well as the additional money for the Holocaust Educational Trust. There is no place for hate in our society, and I know that across the House we will work together to eliminate it. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor calls this an autumn statement for growth, but it is Labour who has led the agenda on growth. And today we see the Conservatives have released their own poor cover version of what we have already announced. The Chancellor today is talking about unlocking capital by reforming pensions. But Labour would go further, encouraging investment into British start-up firms and scale-up firms, and introducing measures to ensure the consolidation of pension funds, so that our pension system gets better returns for savers and for the UK economy. On planning, the Conservatives are following Labour's lead on providing money off bills for communities that host grid infrastructure and speeding up planning decisions. What's taken them so long? Labour will get Britain building again, with a once-in-a-generation set of reforms to accelerate the building of our country's national infrastructure and to build housing too. We will fast-track battery factories, our life sciences and 5G technology to grow our economy and provide good jobs in every part of our country. And we welcome the fact that the Chancellor has announced that he will make full expensing permanent, another thing that we have been calling for. But that doesn't make up for the years of uncertainty that businesses have faced, with taxes going up and down like a yo-yo. With small and medium businesses who play such a pivotal role in growing our economy, left exposed to the Tories' economic volatility. Labour's partnership with business will get our economy firing on all cylinders. That's why this week we established a new British Infrastructure Council with key investors in the UK economy, focused on unlocking private investment by addressing the delivery challenges businesses face when investing in Britain. Through Labour's new National Wealth Fund, we will work alongside the private sector to back the growth of British industries so that we can make the crucial transition to a zero-carbon economy. Yep. And for every pound of public investment, we will leverage in 3 times as much private investment, whilst also getting a return to taxpayers. Labour's plan will boost our economy, get debt falling and make working people better off. Yeah. Now, Mr Speaker, if you listen to the benches opposite, you would believe that the cost of living crisis was behind us. But inflation is still double the Bank of England's target rate. I know the importance of low and stable inflation from my time as an economist at the Bank of England. Now, it is of course welcome that the Chancellor has accepted this year's recommendations from the Low Pay Commission that we set up on the minimum wage. But the reality is, of the Conservatives' record, that average wages for working people have been held back. Under this government, real average weekly wages have increased by just 3% in 13 years, compared to a 27% increase under the last Labour government, worth an additional £120 more every week for someone going out to work every day. And today, Mr Speaker, is Equal Pay Day. So it is also important to recognise that the living standards of working women have also been held back by a gender pay gap that I am determined to close. Yeah. Now, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister say that the cost of living crisis is dealt with. Now, everything might look a little bit better 10,000 feet up in your helicopter. But down here on planet Earth, people are approaching Christmas and the year ahead with worry and trepidation. The cost of living crisis has hit us harder because Tory mismanagement has left us so exposed. 11 million UK households don't have enough savings to cover 3 weeks of living expenses if they needed it. Working families have been skating on thin ice for too long. And as their resilience has been eroded, so has our national economies. Let's not forget, it was this government that oversaw the closure of our critical gas storage facilities, which left our country more exposed to the huge fluctuations in international energy markets. While the former Prime Minister, that's 4 Prime Ministers ago, cut energy efficiency programmes leading to higher bills for homeowners. And just last year, we saw the true cost of the Conservatives when their kamikaze budget crashed the economy, leading to market turmoil, pensions put in peril and a spike in interest rates. 1.6 million families will see their mortgage deals end this year. Those remortgaging since July have seen their payments rocket by an average of £220 a month. And next year, 1.5 million families will face a similar fate. The Conservatives' economic recklessness inflicted a Tory mortgage penalty on families across the country. In Wellingborough, families with a mortgage will be expected to find an additional £190 every single month. In Richmond, North Yorkshire, homeowners face £200 more a month on their mortgage. And in the Chancellor's own constituency, but maybe not for long, families with a mortgage will see an average increase of £420 a month because of this Conservative government's economic failure. And with increased costs for landlords, and the Chancellor knows something about that as well, renters are paying a high price too. The truth is, Mr Speaker, working people just don't have this sort of money lying around. But this is what we've come to after 13 years of Conservative government. And this is the record upon which people will judge the Conservatives at the next election. This Tory economic recklessness is not a thing of the past. The British people are still paying the price. And we say never again. Last week, Labour put forward an amendment to the King's Speech to put our fiscal lock into law. It would prevent a repeat of last year's economic horror show. And yet the Tories voted against it. It is clear that today, Labour is the party of economic and fiscal responsibility. And what have the Conservatives learnt? The Conservatives have learnt absolutely nothing. Mr Speaker, the country is crying out for change. A decaying government can change its personnel, but they have failed to change the direction of our country. In 13 years, we've had 7 chancellors. You wouldn't run a business like this. And you can't run a country like it either. And the Prime Minister can't even promise that this Chancellor will be in place at the next election. Now, we've all heard the reports. When they first came together, it was the fairy tale marriage. But 1 year on, the relationship has hit the rocks. The pair have grown apart, with rumours running rife that the Prime Minister already has his eyes on someone else. But whoever this Prime Minister picks as the Chancellor, the truth is this: Britain is and will be worse off under the Conservatives. They have held back growth. They have crashed our economy, increased debt, trashed our public services, left businesses out in the cold and made life harder for working people. Our country cannot afford 5 more years of the Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, the Ravens are leaving the tower when even Saatchi and Saatchi are saying the Tories are not working. And the questions that people will be asking at the next election and after today's autumn statements are simple. Do me and my family feel better off after 13 years of Conservative government? No. Do our schools, our hospitals, our police, do they work better after 13 years of Conservative government? In fact, does anything in Britain work better today than when the Conservatives came into office 13 years ago? We all know that working people are worse off under the Conservatives, with growth down, mortgages up, prices up, taxes up, debt up, and, Mr. Speaker, their time is up. It is time for change, a changed Labour Party to lead Britain and to make working people better off.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has just sat down after delivering her response to the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who is now responding to her. But before that, in an hour-long, almost an hour-long speech, he outlined big changes, he said, to business and, of course, as expected, those cuts to national insurance. The surprise, if you like, is that he cut national insurance by more than we had thought. He said it's a turning point in the economy, and that allowed him to actually introduce these tax cuts. And they are coming in, some of them, in January, not next April, as we might have expected. So let's outline a couple of them. In national insurance, there is the cut of 2% from the 12% main employee national insurance rate, which Jeremy Hunt says will help 27 million people and save those on an average income of £35,000 a year about £450. And he said, I can deliver that tax cut responsibly and without fuelling inflation because the Office for Budget Responsibility has said so. He then went on to the cuts for national insurance for self-employed. Class 2, they're called national insurance flat rate. It's been abolished. That will save a certain amount of money combined with what they call a Class 4 national insurance rate would save £350 a year for about 2 million self-employed. This was announced against a backdrop of figures on growth, which were significantly downgraded this year, next year and the year after. But he said that the government was going for growth, and they were doing so by what he terms as many supply-side reforms, including all sorts of measures to boost business. The OBR, he said, will contribute £20 billion a year in business investment. Well, I'm happy to say we have a Treasury Minister here with us to discuss all that. Gareth Davis, welcome to you. About £10 billion worth of tax cuts, which I have broadly outlined. But do you accept, overall, you're still raising taxes?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I think that today was an autumn statement for growth, and it had 3 major components. The first is to reward work, and that's by cutting national insurance contributions for both employees and for the self-employed. We're also making sure that work pays by raising the national living wage to £11.44. That is the largest rise in the national living wage. We're boosting investment, as you say, by some £20 billion, which is the key aspect to getting growth motoring in this country. And we're supporting the vulnerable by upgrading pensions, by earnings and benefits by 6.7%.
But Will, overall, are you still raising taxes?
So we have brought 3 million people out of paying any tax at all since 2010.
But the answer is yes, isn't it?
And what we have had to do in the period since, particularly from the pandemic, is make really difficult decisions. We've cut significant taxes today. We'd like to go further in the future, but we still have to make sure that we're managing the finances responsibly. You know, inflation is still, you know, it's down significantly, but it's still too high, and we want to ensure that we keep paying down our debt.
Right. I mean, as I said, let's just show you this graph because it comes from one of the books we've got here on our desks in the studio. It's from the Office for Budget Responsibility. And you can see here the lines towards the end. It's a little bit complicated, but you can still see the trajectory is still upwards when you look at taxes as a share of GDP. They are going up, and they are going up significantly. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have said that in total you've raised taxes overall by £100 billion a year, and that's just since the last election. You've announced something in the region of £10 billion of tax cuts. But in the end, it's a drop in the ocean.
If you look at where we're cutting tax to reward work and stimulate growth. So if you actually look at what we're trying to achieve with this budget, we're trying to achieve strong economic growth over a sustained long-term period of time. And as I say, reward work by cutting the national insurance contributions, while also being able to make sure work pays. So if you just look at where we're cutting tax, you understand our approach and our strategy for the British people.
But you also have to admit that you have increased taxes. You aren't the party of low taxation. You're the party of high taxation. And we've seen it right across this Parliament. It would just be good to hear a minister in the Treasury say, you're right.
Well, we completely accept that on the back of two global shocks in this Parliament, so COVID, which we provided £400 billion of support for families and businesses throughout the country, and energy support of £94 billion, we believe in paying back our debt. We make no apology for it, and that requires yes, raising revenue and making really difficult decisions on spending. Right. And that's why you're seeing debt come down.
So how can we afford these tax cuts then?
Well, we can afford these tax cuts for two main reasons. One is that we've reached our commitment to halve inflation by the end of this year. So as you saw last week, it came down by...
Prices are still going up. They're just going up.
Shut up now. Shut up. Just shut up. I'm done. We heard the Chancellor speak, and fucking shut up. Fucking shut up already, you fucking clown, you arse-licking dog shit motherfucker. Oh, well, you know, the reason why fucking dick fucking cocksucking son of a... Fucking shut up. Shut the fuck up. The reason why they got money to spend is because they put everybody's taxes up and pretended like, oh, well, we're not going to do that. And they did. You know why they got 7 billion quid in their skyrocket, ladies and gentlemen? Because they literally froze the tax threshold on which you pay tax. Is nobody paying attention? That's why they got so much money. They froze the tax threshold. What you pay tax, they froze it. You're going to pay tax now, bitches. Now they got money to spend. Their entire ploy is to pretend that the Tory party are doing a good job. Couldn't let's all just not live in fucking fantasy land for 5 fucking goddamn seconds? Why is fucking Jeremy fucking Hunt the Chancellor of the Exchequer? Can anybody tell me that in the side chat? Anybody who pays any attention to politics? Anybody? Do you know why he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer? Because the last Prime Minister, who was a Conservative, fucking blew up the economy and got sacked by his own party and got beat by lettuce. That's why he's got a job. And I was like, no, we're going to fix it. We're gonna... Shut up, you fucking moron. Shut the fuck up. Shut up. That's why I don't like people watching these shows thinking, oh, just listen to this guy talk complete shit and it's all fine. Sunny uplands and all that shit. It's like I listen to James O'Brien, he's mad about Brexit. Bro, James O'Brien is the reason why we got Brexit. Fucking Trump. You and your fucking dad and his newspapers feeding people right-wing fucking propaganda system of fucking bone. We're being invaded by fucking boats and all that bullshit. Are you fucking mad, really? And now they're going to tell you that the Conservatives somehow are going to do anything different than not fuck up our country. They've been in power for 13 fucking years. You can't get more fucked up than the country already is. Nothing works the way it used to, shall we say. Under Labour, it worked. Shit worked. Even the trains, that's a mad thing to say, but even the trains worked. And now we got Tories. It's like listening to Donald Trump. It literally is. It's like fucking bizarre. It's fucking bizarre. These fucking crackers who they just don't deserve to be in power. Like, I'm not saying that. Well, I am saying the Labour Party are better. Because listen to Rachel Reeves speaking. It's like she should be the Prime Minister of the country. Rachel Reeves, God bless you. Do you know where their job was? If you listen to my last fucking mad rant at the end of the show. I don't even care about this shit anymore. I don't want to listen to these faggots, right? The last time I spoke, I told you Rachel Reeves' job. Well, sorry. Okay, let me rewind on my own brain. We elect politicians on personality complexes and shit like that, right? Because you're not qualified to do fuck all. The only one person I can honestly agree is qualified to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. Rachel Reeves. Do you know why? She worked for the Bank of fucking England. If you came to me, I'm your boss. What's your qualifications? Osborne. I got a history major. You're fired. Rachel Reeves, what did you used to do? I used to work for the Bank of England, hired. Give her a fucking job right now. Put her in charge. Are you mad? Are you fucking mad? Oh, Labour, shut up. None of them people on the front bench of the Tory party are remotely qualified to know anything about economics. What did Rachel Reeves do all her life? Economics. I trust her. That's like me asking, I need a plumber, and then a fucking electrician shows up. Get the fuck out of here, I don't need an electrician. No. And these fucking motherfuckers are gonna spin you a fucking yarn. Like him, this cunt's gonna tell you how good the Conservatives have been. 13 years. Biggest strikes ever, and they're still gonna tell you it's good for business. Fuck off.
Having expanded, extended and hit super high inflation, it's going to raise £44.6 billion by 2028-29 in 1 year. So this is not a tax cut, is it? You've taken the taxes via thresholds in a sort of stealthy way that people don't notice as much. And then you've given a little bit back in the form of national insurance, and you want loads of credit for that.
Listen to what he just said. Listen to exactly what he just said. They fucking froze the rate at which you pay tax. They froze it, which means everybody started paying tax. They collected all the money, didn't say shit to anybody. Stealth tax. Listen carefully. And that motherfucker used to work for Sky News, by the way, in case no one's paying attention. Anyway, he's just pointing out what I just said in my little rant. They froze the tax threshold, bitch. They did the same thing with the police. We've got 10,000 more police. No, we ain't. Since when have we got 10,000 more police? You fucking sacked 20,000 of them, you fucking cock-one balls, because you read that shit on a spreadsheet. Oh, I hate the Tories. Oh, we're giving you some shit. No, you ain't. You ain't giving me nothing. You're trying to say, here's something that you should be happy for, even though we took it away from you through 10 years of austerity under the guess who? David fucking Cameron. David fucking Cameron took all your fucking shit away, and then now you're gonna give us it back, and now we need to clap like I'm a happy fucking man. who's got no fucking brains, apparently. Anybody who votes for these fucking cockwombles needs to slap. Anybody who thinks the Tories are remotely fucking competent to run the country are fucking stupid. These fucking dumb fucking cunts have ruined our country, and the only reason why, ladies and gentlemen, is power. Fucking power. These bastards are fucking ruthless. I'll give them that. They remind me of the Republicans in America. Ruthless fucking cunts. Comes to run the country, fucking incompetent. Fucking incompetent, honestly. I lived under Thatcher. Bring back Thatcher. If we're going to have a Tory party, bring back Thatcher. At least you know what neoliberalism is. These far-right fucking dumb fucking cunts couldn't find a calculator. Fucking use a fucking calculator. Even if they fucking tried. Fucking twats. Fucking honourable
reference
twats.
the freezing of thresholds. That was in 2021 on the back of a pandemic where we spent £400 billion supporting families and businesses. And yes, we need to pay that debt down. So we have to take very difficult decisions. We'd like to go further in our
Why don't you
tax
unfreeze
cuts.
them?
But what we are doing is we're focusing on national insurance contributions, which focuses on work. We want to reward work. Income tax includes lots of different types of income, such as dividends and other. We are focusing on national insurance contributions for employees because that absolutely focuses on rewarding
I don't say why wouldn't increasing the thresholds reward work? Because so many people have been dragged into a higher tax band. You know, they're paying more tax on their income. Why wouldn't that reward work? And that would reverse the freezing of tax thresholds, which has brought in so much money because of inflation.
Because that includes not just earnings from work, it can include earnings from dividends and other areas of income. What we want to do with this package is reward specifically work. And that's what national
percent of it, or 95% of it, is from people's income from work, isn't it?
Well, I don't recognise those figures, but national insurance, what is indisputable is that national insurance contributions for self-employed and employees focuses on those in work, not income from other means of income. And
If you had raised thresholds anywhere near in line with inflation, people would be talking about a genuine tax cut. This looks entirely cosmetic as a token, when in fact, actually, as Faisal was saying, it's £45 billion a year extra in tax by the end of this period.
That is not something I accept. I think this is a significant tax cut for those in work. Those self-employed, are abolishing one of the taxes. We're cutting it from 9 to 8% for other self-employed people.
Yes,
to walk through just some of those numbers, just from the conversation of the last couple of minutes, looking at the Office for Budget Responsibility document, saying that the tax changes in this autumn statement reduce the tax burden by 0.7% of GDP, but it still rises in every year to a post-war high of 37.7% by 2028-29.
So that figure doesn't change, does it?
And then just a couple of other numbers. By 28-29, those frozen thresholds, these thresholds that we're talking about at the moment, this concept of fiscal drag as it's known, result in nearly 4 million additional workers paying income tax, 3 million moving into the higher rate, 400,000 into the additional rate.
Gareth?
You're taking this whole discussion is focused on you picking a point in time since 2010.
It's about us reading the Office for Budget Responsibility.
You're reading it brilliantly, but you are picking. It is a fact. You're doing very well at reading out, but it is a fact that you're picking a point in time, which is 2021, where we made a really difficult decision to freeze the thresholds. I take another period of time, which is since 2010, we've brought 3 million people out of paying any tax whatsoever. In this country, you can now earn, thanks to this Conservative government, £1,000 a month because you pay no tax. You are not included.
Like, am I supposed to clap? You can earn so much money. Bitch, Amazon doesn't even pay any fucking tax. What's your point? Therein lies your problem. Amazon don't pay no tax. Facebook don't pay no tax. Nobody pays tax who's rich. All the poor motherfuckers who live in this country pay tax though. Every one of us pays tax. These fucking rich motherfuckers don't though. Last time I checked, when was the last time Amazon paid tax in the United Kingdom? Never. BP don't. BP, Shell, and all these companies that the fossil fuel companies, they get subsidies. We pay them. Do you understand that? We pay them. And they still make millions and millions and millions and millions in profits. Fucking tramps. Fucking clowns.
Right, but
3 million people are paying no tax in our country thanks to the change.
It's a roller coaster, isn't it? It's something like 66% of people of adults were taxpayers, and by the end of this process, according to the IFS, it will be 66% again.
And actually, the sort of conclusion from what Chris has just read from there is that what the OBR is saying is that everything that has been spelt out and outlined today, still there will be a record tax burden. The tax burden will be at a record high, despite everything you've announced, and I take your point about the cuts in national insurance and what that could mean. But when you step back, the tax burden will still be at a record high, and you accept that.
Well, I'll repeat what I said earlier. People don't like to talk about this anymore in the press, but we had a once-in-a-generation... Hang on, let me just finish, because it is important. We had a once-in-a-generation global pandemic.
Yes, we did. And before that very once-in-a-lifetime generation of a pandemic, Boris Johnson borrowed £500 billion. 600 trillion. Do you know why I know that? Because I streamed it live on my channel. So don't tell me what I don't know. This is the beautiful thing about actually being a streamer who streams politics more than most people do. I literally stream these TV shows, as you quite well know, because you're actually watching me do it. I literally watched Boris Johnson, with a smile, announce when he beat Jeremy Corbyn that he's borrowed 600 billion quid just before the pandemic happened. Just pointing out these facts in case nobody knows them. Just so in case anybody's thinking I'm lying. What do you think I do? What do you think I do on my channel? Look at all my streams. Do you think I don't stream politics live? What do you think I did on my other channel with 5,000 subscribers on it? Tell me. I did the exact same shit. I know what I'm talking about. And these fuckers are bumperclarts of the highest fucking order. They're like the sun in blue suits. Fucking scum.
In that time, we stepped in with £400 billion of support. The measures that we introduced cost a lot, and it increased our debt to a significant level. Absolutely. We make no apology for supporting families and businesses and the most vulnerable through a global pandemic. That needs paying back. We believe in paying back our debt. When the global energy prices spiked, we stepped in and paid half of people's energy bills. And I came on shows like this and I was interviewed saying, what are you going to do to support people with, look at this graph on wholesale gas prices. Well, we stepped in and paid half of people's bills. That costs money. But we also believe in sustainable public finances, which means paying that back. And I'm afraid that means taking really difficult decisions on spending. And it also means making really difficult decisions. It means making difficult decisions on taxes. Today, we are showing the British public that we want to cut taxes. We are significantly cutting taxes. We want to go further, but we're not going to do anything that is both inflationary or puts public finances in jeopardy.
And all we're asking are about the political choices, because you could have done other things. Yes, we haven't forgotten about the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. Growth has been higher since just before the pandemic. It is all about where you take your...
Hold on, wait, before people start going on Crackville. No, these fuckers put us in austerity since 2010. Watch my other stream. These fuckers have been making money off the back of the poor since they got in power. Since they got in power, receipts. Go watch the stream I did on Sunday. Laura Koonsberg literally shows you the graph since 2010 when they implemented austerity, how much tax they have got ever since then. And it's gone up in a steady scale until COVID, and it took a little dip. Boop, right? Ever since then, they've been robbing people and we're still broke. How's that? How can you tax us? How can you have the biggest tax bill in 70 years and everyone's fucking broke? No better services. But yet the rich keep getting richer. I wonder why that is. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, that the fact that the people who run our country only think about one thing, being rich. Because they're all rich anyway. Rishi Sunak, people hate the king and the royal family. That's fine. Rishi Sunak's got more money than the fucking king. And that motherfucker owns the entire fucking country. Technically he doesn't own it, but you get the point, right? Why aren't you mad at fucking a Tory who fucking owns way more fucking wealth, technically speaking, than the King of England? Are you mad? These fuckers are having a laugh. And then they've got some mad ideology where they're still trying to convince you that if you piss on my shoe, it's raining. Where the fuck does that come from? These people give you globalization, motherfucker. I just want you to know that. The very same people destroyed our country because they sold all of our shit to China. These fuckers, just like Nixon, just like Reagan, they sold our fucking countries to other rich people and slaves. Let's give our countries to fucking slaves. That's a good idea. They don't want to look after the people who live here because that's not what they're on about. They just see us as commodities. Like fucking gas and fucking oil and wheat. We're commodities to these fucking retards. Sometimes you'll catch these sneaky motherfuckers. You know what they say? Britain PLC or UK PLC. PLC, might I remind you, stands for publicly listed company. Fuck that shit. My country's not a publicly listed company. My forefathers didn't die in a fucking war for you to think that you can buy and sell my country. No, no, no. Nope. Fucking no. That's why I hate these horrible cunts. Tories are horrible cunts. They really are. They just make shit up as they go along and try to pretend you that it's good for you. It ain't good for me. Fucking bitch. So the last 13 years been good for anybody? No. If they were so good at their job, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But we are, because they're shit at their fucking job. And now they're going to make it even better after being shit for 13 fucking years. Oh my God. I don't even want to listen to it.
Use borrowing. I think, actually, Jeremy Hunt was quoting again Nigel Lawson, Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor. He did say over the weekend that says extra borrowing always means extra taxes in the future. So you will have to raise taxes later to pay for the taxes you've cut today.
Not if we stimulate significant growth in our economy. Yeah, but that's why business investment, unlocking business investment will both boost employment, will bring investment, FDI, the reforms that we've made to FDI, the planning and grids reforms, all of these things, the capital allowances, which all the major business investment bodies asked for, their number one ask was make full expensing permanent. We're doing all of that. And, you know, just the full expensing alone, the OBR forecast that will bring in £14 billion, £3 billion a year in the forecast.
Simon?
Yes, I'm just going to range on that. In the OBR book, it says, actually, as a result of making this permanent, they expect lower investment in the short term, because obviously people wanted to invest before it expired. So you're actually going to see lower investment in the next 2 years. They do admit it'll be higher in last years, but the question they question about whether it works or not. They say of the £10.9 billion cost of this tax cut in 2028-29. 9.2 billion derives from the static costing. This is investment that would have happened anyway, and only 1.8 billion of the cost is because of extra investment that this very measure has stimulated. So in a way, the OBR is saying it's a very expensive policy and it's questionable whether it works or not. They've put it under the highly sensitive or highly uncertain category of tax cuts. You're putting a lot of weight on this.
Well, it's what industry has asked for by a disproportionate amount. We know that it will stimulate increased investment. Forecasts are forecasts, but we know that this is part of a broader package. There's 120 different measures. Yes, it's a massive, significant part of our tax offer. By the way, we're also freezing business rates for small business as well. So we are looking to boost investment through tax measures, but also non-tax measures, such as the planning, the grids, the energy companies that want to come here and connect to the grid. We're making that a lot easier. And
so do you
this
think
is all part of a big package.
And just on that planning thing, I think what you're saying is you're going to give £10,000 over 10 years to people affected by energy infrastructure, which is very close to them. And that you think you can cut the planning time for some of the offshore wind, for example, from 15 to 7 years, as per the Nick Windsor report. Many governments, local and national, have foundered on the rocks of thinking that they can change the planning rules. Do you think £10,000 bribe is going to do it?
Well, the principle behind it is that if you are willing to host, if you are able to host, willing to host nationally significant infrastructure that will benefit the whole country, we believe that you should benefit too. And so the community benefit aspect is absolutely right in my view. Yes.
And thank you for staying with us so long. There are just two more things, Gareth Davis, that I want to show you. This is, if you like, the visual graph of what Chris was explaining earlier. Tax as a percentage of GDP. We showed it before the autumn statement. You can see there the dotted line at the end. That projection is still pretty well the same. The new figure.
Right, look at that graph, right? And this makes it even more clear. Look at that graph. When did Gordon Brown leave office, ladies and gentlemen? When did Labour leave office? When did Labour leave office? Right? And when did they implement austerity in this country? I'm just asking. Look at all that tax rises. And shit's got worse, even though they've taxed us more. Shit's got worse, but they taxed us more. Look at it. It's right there. 2010. That's when Gordon Brown didn't win the election. Look at it. They've made all that money. I like Laura Koonsberg ones because it's a bit better, but the same point. It was going up. Up, up, up. And that was all the time they implemented austerity. They made money from the fucking poor, not the fucking rich motherfuckers. Look at that carefully, very carefully. That's the government being fucking inept. 1995 to 2000, whatever. Who cares? I don't care. Just look at that one. Took a fucking nosedive. 2009, 2010, 2010. I was going to say Jeremy Corbyn. Gordon Brown, dead. Lost the election. We get Conservatives and the Lib Dems. Right then. Robbing you ever since. On the backs of the poor people. Best you know it. No other way to describe that fucking graph, motherfucker. And the country, this is the mad part, has got fucking shitter. Even though they took all in that money, got shitter.
It's 37.7%, that record high from the Office for Budget Responsibility. And when we come back to the issue of choices, of course, you could have used some of the, what we broadly call headroom, to put into public services, for example. I think, Faisal, you have
so
something...
OBR has just said that if you were to spend the same inflation adjusted on public services, you'd have allocated another £19 billion to them just to keep the services going with the prices having gone up so much. But the Chancellor has just added £4 billion a year in cash terms. That means a squeeze on public services at a time when many of our viewers will be saying, well, public services don't seem to be in the smartest nick. Let's put it like that.
Well, what I respond to that is, as the Chancellor pointed out, in real terms, spending on public services is going up by some £85 billion in real terms.
In real terms? On what mathematics are you using? Can you not read the graph, motherfucker? Real terms? Bitch, when Labour were in power, they spent 4.4% of GDP on the National Health Service. You know what it was when the Tories took over? 2.2 or 2.3%. And they say, in real terms, we give them more money. Yeah, to catch up to where it should have been in 1997. What kind of crack are you smoking? They say the same shit about the police I just mentioned before. We've got more police than ever. No, we haven't. You sacked 10,000 police officers. How have we got more police than we've ever had if you sacked 10,000 of them? We're starting from a lower base than which we had in 19... What are you on about? You fucking dopey cunts. This is what oh my god. It's literally like watching American politics, and that's fucking creepy shit. I know because I watch that too. Yeah, I never stream it for you guys because I don't think you're interested in American politics. But oh my fucking god. You think British politics is bad? Watch American politics, it's even more insane. But these fucking crackheads, honestly, think they're American. Like everybody in Britain is fucking American. Or at least a hillbilly, shall we say. No offense to my American viewers, but you get the fucking point, right? These fuckers literally get their fucking, I don't know, whatever's marching orders, clearly from some American think tank. Hint, hint, hint. Because I know they do, because I haven't finished my documentary on the think tanks that occupy London yet, but I will get round to it. Here's the ending. The all-American Republicans who fund right-wing politicians in the United Kingdom. They're actually not Russians, American right-wingers, Christians, pretty creepy. But I'll get to that later.
Over. In real terms. And it's an £85 billion increase in public services over the period. But we do want our public services to work better as well, and that's why we've got a productivity review. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, no, carry on.
So that's my response to that, which is we are seeing a real terms increase in public spending. We have decided with this autumn statement to focus on growth, and we make no apologies for that. We want to reward work and we want to stimulate growth.
We have to let you go. Thank you very much, Gareth Davis from the Treasury Minister there, for joining us. In a moment, we're going to speak to Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. But before that, let me just remind everyone of the key measures that were announced by Jeremy Hunt in that autumn statement. The headline, national insurance cut 2%, not just 1%, as we were perhaps expecting, from 12 to 10, and that is from January the 6th. The minimum wage, which we knew about, to increase to £11.44 per hour from April for workers aged 21 and over. As Simon was saying earlier, that's come down to a lower age. Mandatory work placements for job seekers who have not found work after 18 months. And I think if they don't accept something that's offered to them after a further 6 months, then their benefits, or their case, will be closed and their benefits will be stopped. We're also going to say goodbye to Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, and be joined by Vicky Young, who is the deputy political editor. The key measures here: state pension to increase by 8.5%.
I want to read this out loud. Mandatory. It's mandatory. Can I read? Go backwards a little second. It's just too funny. Go back. Go back, bitch. I'm sorry. I don't want to go back. Mandatory work placements for job seekers who have not found work after 18 months. Okay, I'm gonna be honest, right? First of all, if you're looking for a job, that's a long ass time not to be looking for a job. Who's that to? Mandatory is the scary word though in that sentence. Like you're gonna force people to be destitute. I mean, okay, how many people out of the population of the world wants to be job seeking and not get a job after 18 months? I mean, if you're able, to be fair. Let's be honest. If you're able to it, I don't know anybody in my life that I've met, and I've been around for a long time, right? I don't know anybody who thinks I'm just gonna sit on my ass for 18 months and enjoy being broke. If you could work, like who does that? Like honestly, and I've worked as a cleaner. I'll put that out there. I've done a lot of weird jobs, but you know the thing about it is they pay more than being on the dole. So if you're eligible, I'm just saying, like they must be kind of crazy, strange people, and I doubt there's many of them. There must be like 10. I mean, to be fair, right? We could say that to the government because the government hasn't done their fucking job in 18 months. In fact, they haven't done their job for 13 years. Maybe should they get the fucking sack, right? Or get their benefits, you know, the shit that you get for being an MP. Maybe you should take that away from you if you can't do your fucking job. How about that? How about we apply the same rules to poor fucking retards, right? And apply it to you. How much you get paid every month or every year? Mr. Cunt, yeah, it's like 80, 90 grand a year. What exactly do you do? What do you do again? Nothing. He told me inflation came down because the government. No, it's not. That's why we made the Bank of Ireland independent. I mean, what the fuck are you on about, you crackhead? Okay, convince me. You're pissing my shoes on me, friend. Blah, blah, blah.
From April for workers aged 21 and over. As Simon was saying earlier, that's come down to a lower age. Mandatory work placements for job seekers who have not found work after 18 months. And I think if they don't accept something that's offered to them after a further 6 months, then their benefits or their case will be closed and their benefits will be stopped. We're also going to say goodbye to Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, and be joined by Vicky Young, who is the deputy political editor. The key measures here: state pension to increase by 8.5% to £221.20 a week from April. It was one of those things that was discussed, a straw man, if you like, but in the end, the state pension is rising by the highest figure available from September, and that is 8.5%. That will be expensive. Universal credit and other benefits will be increased from April by 6.7%. As usual, the September figure higher than the October one. Local housing allowance rate to increase to the 30th percentile of local market rents. That will be welcomed. And all alcohol duty, yes, well, many people will be raising a glass to this, will be frozen until August the 1st next year, not least the hospitality industry. 75% of business rates discount for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, extended for another year. And then the national insurance cut for the self-employed, what's called Class 2 national insurance contributions, they're abolished. Full expensing. And it is a big tax break. Jeremy Hunt said it is the most, I think the largest in history in terms of business taxes. Tax break for businesses to deduct spending on investment made permanent, and 4 additional investment zones across England and Wales. So, as expected, an awful lot of things included. New rules to encourage local authorities to fast-track business planning applications, to speed up business, in some ways an answer to Keir Starmer's conference speech about being the builders. £450 million to the local authority housing fund to deliver 2,400 new homes. Consultation on allowing any house to be converted into 2 flats, and up to £10,000 off electricity bills over 10 years for those living closest to new power lines, some sort of incentive there for people. So those are some, or certainly an awful lot, of the key measures. Let's welcome Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. We often hear from Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. They say they want taxes on working people to come down. Well, they have. You must be delighted.
We welcome them, but a couple of £100 off a year, when on average families are paying £4,000 more a year under the Tories, doesn't go anywhere near enough. And the reason for that is because the Tories have failed to grow the economy. They've been borrowing to cover up their inability to pay the bills every month for years and years and years. And the economy is in a bad state. I mean, Jeremy Hunt said to us today that everything was looking good, but on growth it's projected to be 0%. Inflation's projected to be higher over the coming years than it had been previously, and the tax burden is still the highest it has been on people since the Second World War. That doesn't seem pretty good to me. Right, because
Keir Starmer again tweeting today, criticising the government along the same lines by saying that we've had 25 tax rises under the Tories. Which of those 25 Tory tax rises would you cut?
Well, in terms of what we would do in government, we've got to see where we get to at the point of the next election, because today Jeremy Hunt seems to have spent a pretty big chunk of what he described as his fiscal headroom, the cash down the back of the sofa. In a normal time, you would expect 20 to 30 billion quid to be saved for things coming up in the future, and he's not had that much for quite some time.
Right, but you're obviously unhappy with the huge number, as you see it, of tax rises and the tax burden as a percentage of GDP, which is going to...
This is my honest opinion of why Labour are failing. Stop saying, we'll see. Stop saying that. Just say, no, we'll do this, regardless. Just say that. Just say, we will do this. We will do this. Just say that. Stop saying, we'll see. Because what it means is you're a fucking inept little cunt. Like literally, it means, like, no one cares. Or we'll do this if we don't. That's no hope. It's just that gives nobody hope as someone who wants to vote at all. Nobody is going to be inspired by you saying we'll see. It's like if I said, can I borrow a tenner, and then someone said we'll see. That's like no in English. The last time I checked. The fuck am I asking you for then, you twat? I'll go and ask somebody else who's going to say yes or fucking no. We'll see is obfuscation. I don't... Labour are a bunch of pussies. They remind me of Russians who play Counter-Strike. Who walk. Don't walk. Just enjoy the game. Get shot. Do better. Learn the game. Aim. What's your problem? Stop obfuscating. Just say, yeah, we won't do the same shit the Tories do because the Tories are fucking shit. Stop saying we'll wait and see what the Tories do next. Fucking shut up. No. No. That's not inspiring by any stretch of anyone's imagination. That's why you're shit. Like, the only reason why, I'm going to be honest, the Tories, I've said this before, you don't win elections in the United Kingdom. You fucking lose them. You lose elections in the United Kingdom. You don't win them. You lose them. Labour are only winning because everybody literally is looking at the Tory party going, oh my fucking God, really? These people have run our country for fuck knows how long, right? So please, stop being Tory light. That's how we got the SNP, for fuck's sake, honestly. And we haven't won since we've had the SNP, ever, as a Labour Party. This is fucking cunts. Someone needs to get sacked and give their communications team a kick up the fucking ass. That's for sure.
Be extremely high. We've discussed that with Gareth Davis. But what would you do? Would you cut taxes more if you had been delivering the autumn statement today?
So we can only cut taxes when we can afford to do so. The fact is the Conservatives have got the economy to a position where there is very, very little money to play with. So we need to do a couple of things which we've been talking about in the Labour
Do you think they were affordable today, these tax cuts?
There's loads of money to play with. Loads. We print our own money. It's whether you're going to convince people to buy your debt. I don't understand why people don't get this. We sell our money on the free market, right? Currency. So people invest on our debt. So the UK says, we want inward investments, which means does anybody want to buy some debt? Anybody? And some people go, you know what? That sounds like a good investment. I'll buy your debt, which means we pay interest on it. It's not that hard to work out unless you're a fucking moron. So the thing is, we're not doing anything that's attractive for inward investment because why am I going to give you money if I don't get paid? You see, the biggest mistake, I was going to say Laura Koonsberg then, the biggest mistake Liz Truss ever made was literally saying, can we borrow money? And everybody's like, yeah, sure, whatever, we'll give you money. How much are you going to pay us back? And she's like, no, you're paying us. And they were like, fuck that shit, no, that's a stupid idea. Why would we pay you to give you money, you fucking moron? That's why she got sacked. Let me make this very clear. I will make sure that you understand this. She asked the free market, can I borrow money? And they all said yes, because that's what free markets do in the currency market. They went, sure, okay. How much are you going to pay us back? Interest, bonds, yields, whatever, gilts. Take your pick. She went, you're paying. They all went, no, you're crazy, bitch. That's why she's no longer Prime Minister. You do understand that, right? She tries to borrow money and make the rich people pay for it. That's not how capitalism works, you stupid bitch. And the same people fucking in government right now, the very same people who came up with that stupid idea are literally running our country into the fucking ground and have been for 13 years. And these fucking cockwombles won't even tell you that shit on TV. Because apparently it's too complex for British people while they're making cups of fucking tea.
We're doing the maths now on adding it all up.
But you welcome them?
Everything I heard today we welcome, but we've got to check the maths because they've got a habit in the Tory party of doing unfunded announcements.
Never happens in the Labour Party, of course.
Well, not under Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves it doesn't, and we've been very, very clear on that. But you're only going to get to a position where you can afford to give further tax cuts to people, which we would like to see in the years ahead, if you get the economy growing and you improve the productivity in the public sector, which the Tories have failed to do over the last 13 years.
Is there just one tax cut that you could give us today that you'd like to see? The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, you're very unhappy with the tax rises. There must be one tax cut that you're looking at.
You've asked me that question before, and I'm going to give you the same answer, which is it would be irresponsible of me at this point in time to start announcing tax cuts when we don't even have the final books before the next election, let alone seen the books if we come into government at the
I'll
next
ask you a broader question then, because I would hate to repeat myself, Darren. Will the overall tax level be higher or lower under a Labour government?
So we want it to come down, but of course we're going to inherit the position if we win the next election.
So just to remind people, this is what it is, or projected to be, tax as a percentage of GDP. Will it be lower than that or higher than that?
Well, at the point of the next election, it might be even higher because of the next budget we've got from the Conservatives in March next year. And that's why I can't answer on specific numbers today, because who knows what they will do over the next 12 months before the election. But we do want the tax burden to come down on working people over the course of the next Parliament if we win the next.
But we do know a couple of tax rises that you want. You want to scrap the non-dom status and you want to put VAT on private school fees. So actually they will go up, won't they?
Well, there's a couple of loopholes that we're closing. So one loophole on non-doms is if you're working here, you should pay your tax here. They get loopholes at the moment. We're going to close those and put that money into the National Health Service and in our schools. Private schools had a loophole where they didn't have to pay VAT, even though they operate as private companies. We will close that and put that money into the education system. And there was a third loophole as well, which is for private equity bosses, where they get charged corporate gains tax, not income tax on their earnings. And we would close that loophole as well. We think those are three tax loophole changes that are appropriate.
Or rises. I mean, if we look at that 28-29 figure, first Labour budget, let's say, after an election.
As much as I love enjoying this shit, I can't be bothered now. I really can't. What did you get from this budget? Nothing. Fucking completely fucking nothing. I will see you all tomorrow. I just can't be asked to waste my time. It's just fucking, it's kleptomaniac. It's kind of shit. Like, I literally can't be listening to it. It's mostly bollocks. I don't even want to listen to Labour because they're equally fucking annoying at this point in terms of what they should be doing with the economy and what these fucking